The narrative embarks on an in-depth exploration of one of the most critical junctures in global history, the American Revolution. For those prepared for an exhaustive expedition through the labyrinth of settler discontents, fiscal contentions, and the ultimate genesis of an independent nation, this account provides a comprehensive perspective. The historical account reveals that the genesis of the American Revolution did not truly commence in 1775 with the momentous shot heard round the world. Instead, this profound saga of colonial insubordination finds its antecedents extending several decades prior, during an era when the bond between Great Britain and its American colonies remained superficially harmonious, much like a family unit grappling with latent dysfunction, yet to fully acknowledge the depth of its internal discord. Observers might envision the British Empire in the nascent 1700s as a presumptuous kinsman, convinced of their inherent wisdom regarding the welfare of all. The empire had recently concluded a succession of costly conflicts, notably the French and Indian War, which spanned from 1754 to 1763. This extensive military endeavor essentially culminated in a highly costly contest for geopolitical dominance in North America between the British and French powers, with various Native American tribes strategically aligning themselves, akin to choosing sides in a perilous, high-stakes athletic competition. The French and Indian War, also recognized as the 7 Years' War, fundamentally represented Britain's resolute determination to prevent France from securing significant territorial and economic advantages within North America. This protracted conflict raged across multiple continents, yet the American theater proved particularly savage and financially draining. British regulars, augmented by colonial militias, engaged in fierce combat against French forces and their indigenous confederates throughout the expansive frontier territories that would eventually form the United States. The war featured several notable episodes, such as a youthful George Washington's initial foray into martial command, which famously resulted in his encirclement at Fort Necessity, an engagement whose outcome was as unfavorable as its name suggested. Ultimately, the British emerged victorious, securing dominion over the majority of French North America. But this triumph exacted a monumental financial toll, a sum so immense it would undoubtedly elicit profound satisfaction from any contemporary defense contractor. The war had burdened Britain with an absolutely staggering sum, roughly equivalent to several $billion in present-day currency. It is at this juncture that events began to unfold with the distinct premonition of impending difficulty. Britain, confronting its enormous wartime liabilities, then cast its gaze upon its American colonies, who had undeniably profited from imperial safeguarding throughout the conflict. The prevailing sentiment was, surely these appreciative colonists will not object to contributing to the costs of their own defense. This line of reasoning appeared plausible until one recalls that the colonists had largely managed their own affairs for over a century, cultivating a rather pronounced autonomous inclination, much like adolescents who suddenly discover their guardians expect them to shoulder a portion of household expenses. The initial significant endeavor to procure fiscal contributions from the colonies manifested as the Sugar Act of 1764. This legislation was, in fact, an amendment to a preceding duty on molasses that had been so routinely disregarded, it had effectively become an unenforceable suggestion. While the Sugar Act nominally reduced the tax on molasses, it crucially ensured genuine enforcement this time, a move comparable to parents finally deciding to impose a long-ignored curfew after years of lax oversight. Furthermore, the Act expanded the jurisdiction of admiralty courts, which adjudicated cases without the benefit of juries, thereby conveying the impression that the British government believed the most effective method for securing colonial allegiance involved abrogating the fundamental right to trial by one's peers. Colonial merchants, particularly those whose commercial strategies relied heavily on what might be charitably termed flexible interpretations of existing trade regulations, were predictably displeased. However, the Sugar Act merely served as the prelude to the principal drama, the Stamp Act of 1765. When referencing paper goods, this encompassed virtually all articles composed of paper: newspapers, legal instruments, playing cards, dice, and even academic diplomas, seemingly reflecting the British government's intent to render even the pursuit of education a costly undertaking. The Stamp Act mandated that all such paper commodities bear a special stamp, which had to be purchased from British officials, effectively transforming every colonial legal practitioner, journalistic publisher, and card enthusiast into an involuntary revenue agent. The imposition was akin to a modern governmental decree requiring a unique official emblem on every digital communication, yet somehow even more vexatious in its practical application. The colonial reaction to the Stamp Act was immediate and demonstrative, akin to a forceful declaration rather than a subtle hint. It is pertinent to observe that, at this particular juncture, this widespread discontent did not necessarily constitute an outright demand for sovereignty. Many colonists would have been quite amenable to fiscal contributions had they possessed actual representatives within Parliament. The fundamental issue arose from the British government's rejoinder to this rational appeal, which essentially amounted to declaring, "You are virtually represented." This assertion provided as little satisfaction as being told one is virtually nourished whilst experiencing genuine hunger. Virtual representation posited that members of Parliament served the collective interests of all British subjects, not merely their specific constituents, a concept that sounded theoretically benevolent but proved practically ineffectual. Opposition to the Stamp Act manifested in diverse forms, ranging from formal petitions and economic boycotts to more assertive interventions that would render contemporary protesters appear remarkably restrained. The Sons of Liberty, an ostensibly clandestine organization whose secrecy rivaled that of a public musical procession, orchestrated widespread resistance across the colonies. Their methods specialized in what might be characterized as forceful conviction, involving actions such as hanging stamp distributors in effigy, ransacking their residences, and unequivocally conveying that assuming the role of a stamp tax collector offered a far from promising trajectory. In Boston, the Sons of Liberty exhibited particular ingenuity, at one point compelling the local stamp distributor to relinquish his post beneath a prominent elm that subsequently became known as the Liberty Tree, underscoring that even revolutionary movements grasped the importance of effective iconography. The Stamp Act Congress convened in New York City in October 1765. 9 colonies dispatched delegates who formulated a formal appeal to the King and Parliament, unequivocally asserting that taxation without representation constituted a profound infringement upon their entitlements as British subjects. The Congress demonstrated notable restraint in its articulation, essentially communicating, "We remain loyal British subjects, but this entire taxation scheme is proving exceedingly problematic for us." It bore the resemblance of a meticulously polite letter signaling the end of a relationship, save for the crucial detail that the relationship itself had not yet concluded. The economic boycott of British commodities, implemented in conjunction with the political protests, proved remarkably potent, partly owing to the pivotal function performed by colonial women in ensuring its efficacy. The Daughters of Liberty organized communal spinning bees to produce homespun cloth, thereby reducing reliance on British textiles. British merchants, witnessing their earnings erode with alarming rapidity, akin to ephemeral campus provisions, began to exert considerable pressure on Parliament to rescind the Stamp Act. The synergistic combination of colonial resistance and British commercial lobbying proved successful, and Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in March 1766, precipitating widespread celebrations throughout the colonies that likely involved a more generous consumption of spirits than strictly necessary. Nonetheless, Parliament was compelled to assert its ultimate authority, enacting the Declaratory Act on the very day it repealed the Stamp Act. The Declaratory Act fundamentally proclaimed, "We are repealing this specific tax, but for absolute clarity, we unequivocally retain the right to impose any taxes upon you at any time as we deem fit." It was analogous to a parent stating, "Very well, you are excused from cleaning your room, but understand that I possess the power to compel you to do so if I wished." The colonists largely disregarded the Declaratory Act, opting instead to focus on their perceived victory over the Stamp Act, a retrospective stance somewhat akin to celebrating a triumphant skirmish while overlooking the ongoing broader conflict. The period of celebration proved ephemeral, for in 1767, Parliament resolved to implement an alternative strategy with the Townshend Acts, named after Charles Townshend, who seemingly failed to glean lessons from the Stamp Act's tumultuous reception. The Townshend Acts imposed levies on imported commodities such as glass, lead, paints, paper, and tea, essentially all goods the colonists required, but could not produce domestically in sufficient quantities. The underlying rationale was that these constituted external taxes on trade rather than internal imposts, unlike the Stamp Act, and thus the colonists would surely find them more acceptable. The Townshend Acts also established a Board of Customs Commissioners in Boston to rigorously enforce the newly mandated duties. The Customs Commissioners were met with predictable antipathy, particularly as they were authorized to deploy writs of assistance, unrestricted search authorizations that permitted them to search any building for smuggled goods. The scope of these writs was so extensive that it rendered the concerns of contemporary privacy advocates appear as reactions to comparatively minor inconveniences. The colonial response to the Townshend Acts followed a customary trajectory. Formal petitions, economic boycotts, and increasingly innovative manifestations of civil defiance. John Dickinson, a Pennsylvania lawyer who evidently possessed ample leisure, authored a series of influential essays titled Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, which cogently argued against the Townshend Acts in language accessible even to non-legal professionals. Dickinson's widely reprinted letters played a crucial role in solidifying settler resistance to the new taxes, thereby demonstrating that intellectual discourse could, at times, prove more potent than direct confrontation, though armed conflict would eventually become a stark reality. The comprehensive refusal to purchase British commodities reached an unprecedented scale, surpassing even the widespread non-importation movements witnessed during the Stamp Act crisis. This widespread economic resistance was rigorously upheld through a dual approach. a pervasive application of societal disapproval and more forceful immediate interventions. Traders and vendors who dared to contravene these collectively established accords frequently discovered their identities publicly disclosed in colonial gazettes, stigmatized as enemies of liberty, or they might experience unsolicited calls from cadres of dedicated compatriots whose appeals regarding one's civic responsibilities were decidedly compelling and difficult to disregard. Simultaneously, within the bustling port city of Boston, the friction between the colonial populace and imperial British authorities was escalating to an explosive degree, creating an atmosphere so volatile it would render a conventional pressure cooker seemingly tranquil by comparison. The much maligned customs commissioners, whose presence was universally regarded with the same disdain as an unwelcome skunk disrupting a refined garden party, formally petitioned for military safeguarding, a plea that culminated in the deployment and subsequent arrival of British troops in Boston during October 1768. The striking visual of uniformed red-coated soldiers parading through Boston's thoroughfares served as an unmistakable and potent emblem of British subjugation, exacerbated by the contentious practice of lodging these soldiers in communal civic structures and even private residences, an arrangement that suggested the British administration curiously believed the most effective strategy for mending strained colonial ties involved compelling inhabitants to accommodate an unwanted military presence. The sustained deployment of British armed forces within Boston inherently generated an incendiary powder keg scenario, characterized by incessant daily skirmishes and burgeoning animosity between the uniformed soldiers and the civilian populace. These military personnel, often receiving meager remuneration, frequently sought auxiliary part-time employment to augment their insufficient wages, thereby entering into direct economic rivalry with indigenous laborers for scarce job opportunities. This fierce financial contestation, interwoven with pronounced cultural divergences and the overarching indignation provoked by the military occupation itself, fostered an environment where even the most trivial occurrence possessed the potential to ignite into a far more substantial and destructive confrontation. It was akin to confining a group of individuals under extreme duress within a cramped enclosure and subsequently expressing bewilderment when interpersonal disputes inevitably erupted. During the event that subsequently entered historical annals as the Boston Massacre, though labeling it a massacre carried a degree of hyperbole comparable to describing a minor fender bender as a full-blown demolition derby, the initial spark ignited from a heated exchange between a lone British sentry and a young colonial wig-maker's apprentice concerning an outstanding financial obligation, demonstrating that even pivotal revolutionary junctures can paradoxically originate from prosaic disagreements over monetary matters. The terse encounter rapidly intensified as additional colonists congregated, unleashing a barrage of snowballs, chunks of ice, and vitriolic taunts upon the progressively agitated British soldiers. When an unidentified voice from within the burgeoning throng audibly commanded "fire," whether intended as a provocative challenge or a direct order, the soldiers discharged their muskets, resulting in the immediate fatalities of 5 colonists and injuries to numerous others. In the aftermath, the Boston Massacre was swiftly transmuted into an exceptionally potent instrument of propaganda by fervent colonial radicals. A widely circulated engraving, whose fidelity to the actual event was roughly equivalent to the veracity found in a contemporary political advertisement, proved extraordinarily efficacious in swaying popular sentiment. This visual portrayal depicted impeccably disciplined British soldiers discharging their weapons in synchronized volleys at an assembly of seemingly tranquil and defenseless colonists, starkly contrasting with the disorderly and tumultuous melee that had genuinely transpired. This incident served as an early, compelling illustration of the profound influence that manipulating public perception or controlling the narrative could wield, often overshadowing the objective presentation of factual occurrences. Paradoxically, the dramatic events of the Boston Massacre inadvertently served to de-escalate hostilities, instigating a temporary abatement of tensions as both disputing factions retreated from the precipice of further conflict. The British government, sagaciously concluding that the Townshend Acts were generating significantly more discord and expense than any tangible benefit, proceeded to annul the majority of these legislative measures in April 1770. Crucially, they retained solely the impost on tea, preserving it as a deliberate symbolic assertion of Parliament's inherent prerogative to levy taxation upon the American colonies. This particular maneuver was akin to meticulously pruning most of the painful thorns from a rosebush, yet deliberately leaving one singularly formidable barb intact, purely as a declarative gesture. The intricate relationship between Great Britain and its American colonies then transitioned into what historical scholars have designated as the Quiet Period. A tranquility, however, that bore a striking resemblance to the deceptive calm exhibited by a volcano during its inter-eruptive phase. The widespread colonial non-importation movements largely dissipated following the rescission of the majority of the Townshend Acts. Commercial exchange consequently recommenced, fostering a widespread sentiment among numerous individuals on both continents that the immediate crisis had successfully been navigated. Nevertheless, figures like Samuel Adams, who could be aptly described as the colonial progenitor of that relentless friend who steadfastly refuses to relinquish a grievance, diligently strove to sustain the fervor of opposition through the establishment of committees of correspondence. These vital networks facilitated seamless communication among various radical factions dispersed across the disparate colonies, effectively functioning as an 18th-century social media platform, albeit one dedicated not to the dissemination of feline videos, but rather to the systematic sharing of profound dissatisfactions with British governmental policy. This deceptive quiet period was precipitously concluded in 1773 by the introduction of the Tea Act, a parliamentary initiative conceived as a strategic endeavor to bolster the economically precarious East India Company by granting it an exclusive dominion over the distribution of tea within the American colonies. While the Tea Act did not in essence impose any additional levy on tea, indeed, its provisions were designed to render tea more economically accessible for colonial purchasers. Its underlying mechanism threatened to dismantle the livelihoods of indigenous tea merchants. This was to be achieved by empowering the East India Company to engage directly with retailers, thereby circumventing the established and intricate network of traditional mercantile intermediaries. The situation bore a striking resemblance to a modern-day corporate giant like Amazon, opting to eliminate all intermediate distributors, with the critical distinction that this 18th-century commercial strategy carried a significantly heightened potential for precipitating armed insurrection. Furthermore, the Tea Act reignited the long-standing and deeply contentious debates surrounding the doctrine of taxation without representation, primarily because the existing duty on tea remained firmly in force. Ardent colonial radicals vociferously contended that acquiescing to the availability of more affordable tea would, in essence, constitute an implicit endorsement of the fundamental principle of parliamentary taxation, notwithstanding any immediate fiscal advantages to consumers. This contentious juncture thus became a stark illustration of principle triumphing over mere practicality, a dynamic that frequently serves as the genesis for history's most pivotal and dramatic transformations. The reaction from the American colonies to the Tea Act was both immediate and remarkably inventive. Across several significant port cities, determined colonists successfully obstructed the unloading of East India Company tea, thereby compelling the vessels to undertake the arduous return voyage to Great Britain with their untouched consignments. In the city of Charleston, the tea was indeed disembarked, yet it was deliberately consigned to the confines of warehouses where it was permitted to deteriorate and rot, a stratagem that likely stands as the quintessential example of passive-aggressive defiance in the annals of colonial protest. However, it was within the vibrant crucible of Boston that the most spectacular and audacious retaliation unfolded, in part attributable to Boston's distinctive knack for transforming contentious political disagreements into compelling public spectacles. The legendary Boston Tea Party, executed on December 16, 1773, emerged as one of the most celebrated instances of civil disobedience in the annals of American history, concurrently ranking among the most fiscally impactful. Upon the arrival of 3 vessels laden with East India Company tea in Boston Harbor, the Sons of Liberty vehemently insisted upon their immediate departure without disembarking their merchandise. While the ship's captains expressed readiness to acquiesce, the steadfast royal governor adamantly withheld the necessary clearance for their egress, thereby initiating a protracted stalemate that persisted for several weeks. Ultimately, a contingent of colonists, some cleverly camouflaged as Mohawk Indians, a choice that hovered ambiguously between ingenious tactical misdirection and genuinely insensitive cultural appropriation, surreptitiously boarded the ships and meticulously jettisoned 342 chests of tea into the frigid waters of Boston Harbor. Remarkably, considering its fundamental nature as a substantial act of premeditated destruction, the Boston Tea Party was executed with an astonishing degree of meticulous discipline. The participants diligently ensured the replacement of a padlock inadvertently damaged amidst the fervor of the operation, scrupulously swept the vessel's decks to pristine condition, and even conscientiously restored a quantity of tea that had fortuitously found its way into one participant's footwear. Their conduct rendered them arguably the most courteous vandals in historical memory, unequivocally demonstrating that even profoundly revolutionary endeavors could be undertaken with an unexpected adherence to decorum. The punitive reaction from the British government to the Boston Tea Party was both immediate and uncompromising, manifesting in the enactment of a comprehensive suite of legislation in 1774. These statutes, pejoratively dubbed the Intolerable Acts by the colonial populace, were more euphemistically referred to as the Coercive Acts by the British administration itself. Among these stringent measures were the Boston Port Act, which effectively sealed off Boston Harbor until restitution for the destroyed tea was rendered; the Massachusetts Government Act, fundamentally abrogating the colony's established charter and subjugating it to direct royal governance; the Administration of Justice Act, which permitted imperial functionaries accused of various offenses to undergo trials in England instead of colonial tribunals; and a revised Quartering Act, which significantly broadened the existing mandate for colonists to provide accommodation for British military personnel. Although the intolerable acts were meticulously formulated with the explicit intention of isolating Massachusetts and establishing a cautionary precedent through the chastisement of Boston, their actual repercussions proved entirely contrary to the intended outcome. Far from coercing the other colonies into a state of docile submission, these draconian legislative measures solidified the conviction among a substantial segment of the colonial population that British governance had devolved into outright tyranny, thereby transforming Massachusetts' localized struggle into a shared cause for all. The situation was uncannily analogous to a schoolyard bully targeting a single student, only to inadvertently forge a powerful unity among the entire student body in opposition to the aggressor. Concurrently enacted with the intolerable acts, the Quebec Act further exacerbated colonial discontent, effectively adding considerable fuel to the burgeoning flames of resentment. This legislation significantly enlarged Quebec's territorial limits southward to the Ohio River and formally guaranteed religious latitude for Roman Catholics residing within Quebec. While the Quebec Act was not officially enumerated as one of the coercive acts, a significant proportion of colonists perceived it as yet another manifestation of British despotism, especially among Protestant settlers who interpreted the official sanctioning of Catholicism as a direct menace to their cherished religious freedoms. Moreover, the inherent provision within the Quebec Act that precluded westward territorial expansion by American colonists rendered it profoundly unpopular, given that, it seemed, few directives provoked greater fury among the settlers than being explicitly denied the opportunity to advance westward and appropriate additional land. The collective colonial reaction to the oppressive, intolerable acts culminated in the convocation of the First Continental Congress, an assembly that convened in Philadelphia during September 1774. 12 of the 13 colonies dispatched their representatives. Notably, Georgia elected to abstain from participation, ostensibly concluding that prudence outweighed bravado, or perhaps merely arriving with an air of fashionable tardiness to the nascent revolutionary festivities. This Congress represented an extraordinary convocation of preeminent colonial figures, a distinguished roster that encompassed several individuals destined to become future presidents, esteemed Supreme Court justices, and at least one notable personality whose life would later conclude tragically in a duel. Who would later be tragically shot in a duel. The inaugural First Continental Congress confronted the daunting task of formulating a unified response to the increasingly oppressive British policies, all the while clinging to a fragile hope for amicable reconciliation. At this nascent stage, the assembled delegates were far from prepared to embrace the radical notion of declaring outright independence from the Crown. The vast majority still identified themselves as faithful British subjects, their primary objective being a peaceful rectification of their accumulating grievances and infringements upon their rights. Their predicament was akin to a couple deeply entrenched in a recurring conflict, perpetually disputing the same fundamental issues, yet collectively hesitant to sever the bonds of their long-standing relationship entirely. In a pivotal move, the Congress formally endorsed a meticulously crafted Declaration of Rights and Grievances, a document that meticulously enumerated the various colonial complaints and injustices stemming from British governmental policies. Even more significantly, they forged a consensus to initiate an extensive and far-reaching embargo on all British commodities, an economic strategy christened the Continental Association. This newly formed Continental Association surpassed all prior boycotts in both its ambitious scope and its meticulous organizational structure. To ensure widespread adherence, local enforcement committees were systematically established in every corner of the colonies. These formidable committees wielded considerable authority, empowered to meticulously scrutinize merchants' inventories, publicly expose the names of any transgressors, and, in essence, render the lives of those unsupportive of the boycott exceedingly challenging. Their function was remarkably similar to a vigilant neighborhood watch initiative, though their surveillance was directed not at apprehending criminals, but rather at identifying individuals who continued to patronize British goods, such as the ubiquitous British tea. Furthermore, the Congress stipulated a subsequent gathering in May 1775, contingent upon the unresolved nature of their stated grievances. This provision effectively presented the British government with an unequivocal ultimatum, complete with a precisely defined deadline for action. Regrettably for all parties concerned, the British government's aptitude for comprehending such stark ultimatums proved to be lamentably deficient, mirroring their pervasive inability to grasp the intricate nuances of colonial psychology. A profound and ultimately detrimental misunderstanding. Concurrently, as the Continental Congress convened its deliberations in Philadelphia, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, an emergent body that had supplanted the royal government, effectively dissolved by the punitive Intolerable Acts, commenced the systematic organization of local militia units and the strategic accumulation of vital armaments and provisions. These burgeoning preparations were spearheaded by prominent figures such as John Hancock, a man who had amassed considerable wealth through illicit smuggling operations and was now adeptly redirecting his formidable organizational acumen toward the burgeoning revolutionary cause. Alongside him was Samuel Adams, who, it seemed, had at last discovered a purpose truly commensurate with his unparalleled talent for political agitation and instigation. Perceiving Massachusetts to be teetering on the precipice of open rebellion, the British government consequently appointed General Thomas Gage. Gage found himself burdened with the thankless responsibility of upholding British authority within a colony where the very concept of British rule garnered about as much public favor as an intrusive and unwelcome tax audit. Paradoxically, Gage was known to be an inherently reasonable individual, possessing a more nuanced comprehension of the colonial viewpoint than many of his British counterparts, a perspective undoubtedly shaped by his extensive years of service in America and his marriage to an American woman. Regrettably, the virtue of reasonableness proved to be of limited utility when confronted with a volatile situation that had demonstrably escalated far beyond the confines of rational discourse and diplomatic resolution. As the early months of 1775 unfolded, both the colonial factions and the British forces found themselves engaged in a dual process, assiduously preparing for an inevitable armed confrontation, yet simultaneously clinging to the diminishing hope of averting outright hostilities. This paradoxical stance mirrored two individuals locked in a heated dispute, continually escalating their rhetoric and actions while vehemently asserting their desire to avoid a physical altercation. On one hand, the colonists were diligently consolidating their militia units and systematically accumulating a cache of weapons and provisions. On the other, the British military strategists were meticulously devising operations aimed at preemptively confiscating these very colonial military supplies. This unfolding scenario perfectly exemplified a classic security dilemma. The defensive preparations undertaken by one side were invariably perceived as offensive posturing by the other, thereby fueling a dangerous and accelerating spiral of mutual mistrust and an intensified military buildup. The pivotal catalyst that ultimately ignited the conflagration of the American Revolution manifested on April 19, 1775, when General Gage dispatched a contingent of approximately 700 British regulars with the express objective of seizing colonial military provisions strategically stockpiled in Concord, Massachusetts. This critical mission was intended to proceed under the cloak of utmost secrecy. However, within a colonial society where a pervasive atmosphere of mutual observation prevailed, maintaining the confidentiality of significant military movements proved to be a formidable challenge, akin to attempting to keep a surprise party clandestine in a close-knit, gossipy small town. The nascent, yet highly effective colonial intelligence network, a decentralized web of informants comprising individuals ranging from astute tavern keepers to diligent stable boys, swiftly disseminated intelligence regarding the British troop movements. Notably, Paul Revere and William Dawes were instrumental in rapidly propagating news of the approaching British forces. It is historically improbable that Revere vociferously proclaimed, "The British are coming," given that the majority of colonists at that juncture still identified themselves as subjects of the British Crown. While Revere's midnight ride has been immortalized in legend, the historical reality reveals that he was, in fact, apprehended by a British patrol prior to reaching Concord, and subsequently compelled to walk back to Lexington, a sequence of events considerably less dramatic than the romanticized narrative often presented in poetry. This serves as a poignant reminder that the intricate tapestry of history often defies the simplistic and embellished tales we choose to recount. At the break of dawn on April 19th, the British column arrived in Lexington, where they were met by approximately 70 colonial militiamen who had resolutely positioned themselves on the verdant village green. This small contingent of militia, under the command of Captain John Parker, found themselves overwhelmingly outnumbered and harbored no genuine intention of engaging in a direct armed confrontation with the professional British regulars. Their presence was primarily intended as a powerful symbolic gesture of defiance, much like attending a public demonstration armed with a protest sign, yet without any sincere expectation of fundamentally altering the prevailing circumstances. Captain Parker is famously reported to have exhorted his men with the words, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." While this declaration possesses a distinctly dramatic resonance, it was likely delivered more in the vein of a pragmatic caution, urging restraint and advising against any rash or ill-considered actions. The subsequent events constitute one of those contentious historical junctures where a definitive consensus on the precise sequence of occurrences remains elusive. This ambiguity, while a source of considerable frustration for meticulous historians, is perhaps entirely characteristic of tumultuous situations involving anxious individuals armed with loaded firearms. Then, a single shot rang out. The renowned shot heard round the world, yet the identity of the individual who discharged it, or indeed whether the act was deliberate, remains shrouded in historical uncertainty. The projectile could have originated from a British soldier, a colonial militiaman, or even resulted from an inadvertent weapon discharge amidst the tension. What is unequivocally established is that in the wake of this initial report, both opposing forces commenced firing. When the acrid gunpowder smoke eventually dissipated, a grim toll was revealed. 8 colonists lay dead and 10 sustained injuries, while only a solitary British soldier suffered a wound. The engagement at Lexington, though fleeting and overwhelmingly lopsided in its immediate casualties, resonated with profound and enduring symbolic significance. The British column then pressed onward to Concord, successfully locating and neutralizing a portion of the colonial military provisions stored there. However, by this juncture, a vast array of colonial militia units were rapidly converging from every corner of the surrounding region, effectively transforming what had been conceived as a straightforward military operation into an exponentially perilous undertaking. The subsequent British withdrawal from Concord back to Boston devolved into a protracted running battle, as colonial militiamen relentlessly harried the retreating column, launching intermittent attacks from the concealment of trees, sturdy stone walls, and various structures. The British soldiers, meticulously drilled in the formalized tactics of European-style warfare, which emphasized disciplined formations and engagements on expansive, open battlefields, found themselves perpetually assailed by an elusive adversary they could seldom clearly discern. Their experience was eerily analogous to navigating a video game populated exclusively by concealed snipers, albeit with the added challenge of muskets that required an agonizingly slow reloading process. Despite their ranks being largely filled by farmers and craftsmen possessing only rudimentary military instruction, the colonial militiamen demonstrated an astonishing efficacy in this unconventional, irregular mode of warfare. Their fierce determination was undoubtedly fueled by the profound imperative of defending their homes and families, a powerful and universally acknowledged incentive. Indeed, the beleaguered British column faced the very real prospect of utter annihilation had it not been for the timely arrival of a relief contingent dispatched from Boston, which rendezvoused with them at Lexington and provided crucial cover for their arduous retreat. As the day drew to a close, the casualty figures presented a stark and unexpected reality. The British had sustained a staggering 273 casualties, in stark contrast to the 95 suffered by the colonists. This outcome represented a shocking subversion of all prior expectations concerning a direct confrontation between highly trained professional soldiers and part-time civilian militia. The momentous news of Lexington and Concord propagated across the colonies with the alacrity of a sensational celebrity scandal, borne by fervent riders who, in their zealous haste to disseminate the electrifying tidings that hostilities had finally commenced, likely shattered numerous land speed records. This rapid dissemination of information effectively led to the immediate besieging of the British garrison in Boston. These converging militiamen, hailing from every corner of New England, arrived equipped with their personal weaponry, provisions, and an extraordinarily diverse spectrum of military experience, encompassing seasoned veterans of the French and Indian War alongside adolescents who had never before discharged a weapon in actual combat. The assembly resembled a chaotic, albeit highly motivated military convention, characterized by its profound disorganization, universal armament, and a collective, palpable fury directed at imperial taxation. The ensuing siege of Boston imposed unforeseen and formidable challenges upon both the British and colonial factions. The British garrison, to their dismay, discovered themselves ensnared within a besieged city, encircled by an adversary they had persistently undervalued. Concurrently, The colonists swiftly realized that the logistical complexities of sustaining a standing army in the field far exceeded the comparatively straightforward task of orchestrating a protest march. The nascent colonial forces were conspicuously deficient in fundamental provisions, ranging from essential gunpowder to rudimentary sanitary facilities like latrines. Furthermore, their nascent command structure exhibited a level of organization comparable to an impromptu pickup basketball game, characterized by its fluid, often chaotic, and largely informal nature. Reconvening merely 3 weeks subsequent to the pivotal clashes at Lexington and Concord, the Continental Congress found itself confronted with a dramatically altered geopolitical landscape, one far removed from their initial expectations. Rather than engaging in diplomatic negotiations with the British government, from a presumed position of moral rectitude, they were now unexpectedly tasked with the formidable responsibility of overseeing an active and escalating military conflict. Their predicament bore a striking resemblance to meticulously planning a peaceful public demonstration, only to inadvertently ignite a full-scale revolution, a scenario that, in essence, accurately described the unfolding events. The New England colonies urgently appealed for collective support. Yet the act of formally assuming responsibility for military operations would represent a significant and perilous escalation, undoubtedly rendering any prospect of reconciliation with Britain considerably more arduous. Conversely, the abandonment of the beleaguered New England forces would, in all likelihood, spell the definitive demise of the entire colonial resistance movement. This presented a classic dilemma, where every available option appeared fraught with undesirable consequences, yet the path of inaction was arguably the most detrimental choice of all. In a momentous decision, the Congress resolved to formally adopt the assembled forces surrounding Boston, christening them the Continental Army, a designation that, at the time, conveyed a greater sense of official gravitas than the nascent reality of its organization truly warranted. A subsequent critical requirement was the selection of a commander-in-chief, a process that inevitably gave rise to intriguing political machinations and strategic alignments. The most apparent candidate might logically have been an individual hailing from New England, given that the epicenter of the conflict was geographically concentrated there. However, the astute members of Congress recognized the paramount necessity of transforming this regional uprising into a genuinely continental endeavor, requiring broader participation. It was John Adams, in a display of particularly keen political foresight, who put forth the nomination of George Washington of Virginia. This strategic choice was motivated partly by Washington's prior, albeit limited, military experience, and partly by the crucial understanding that securing Virginia's robust involvement was indispensable for any realistic prospect of ultimate success. Washington's eventual appointment as commander-in-chief, while appearing almost predetermined through the lens of historical hindsight, was in fact a considerably audacious and uncertain gamble at that moment. While Washington possessed military experience garnered during the French and Indian War, he had never before commanded a force exceeding the size of a single regiment, and his most widely known military accomplishment involved the capitulation of Fort Necessity to the French. Nevertheless, his imposing stature, inherent dignity, and commanding presence, embodying the popular archetype of a military general, proved to be factors of far greater significance than was perhaps consciously acknowledged at the time. This instance serves as a compelling illustration of how, at times, the grand trajectory of history can be swayed by seemingly superficial or aesthetic considerations. General George Washington arrived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in July 1775, assuming command of what was optimistically designated the Continental Army. In reality, this force comprised a disparate assortment of militia units drawn from various colonies, each holding distinct notions regarding military discipline, the proper chain of command, and even rudimentary personal hygiene. The encampments encircling Boston presented conditions that would undoubtedly appall any contemporary health inspector, characterized by woefully inadequate sanitation, severely limited medical provisions, and a hierarchical command structure that largely existed as theoretical constructs rather than practical realities. Washington's immediate and paramount challenge was not to engage the British in direct combat. Rather, it was to transform this unruly armed populace into something recognizably akin to a disciplined military force. The formidable undertaking of forging an army from its nascent stages, while simultaneously orchestrating a prolonged siege, was further complicated by the fact that most militiamen had enlisted for brief tenures, fully expecting to return home for the harvest season. As it appeared, even revolutionary fervor had to accommodate the rhythms of the agricultural calendar. Consequently, Washington found himself in a perpetual state of managing units on the brink of departure. Soldiers who defiantly refused orders from officers hailing from different colonies, and a persistent scarcity of virtually everything, from essential gunpowder to adequate winter apparel. It was an organizational nightmare, akin to attempting to coordinate an extensive camping expedition for several thousand individuals who harbored irreconcilable differences concerning their ultimate destination. Concurrently, as Washington grappled with the immense difficulties of command, the Continental Congress found itself wrestling with the profound question of the ultimate objectives of their burgeoning conflict. A significant number of delegates still harbored hopes for a reconciliation with Great Britain, exhibiting a marked reluctance to endorse measures that would irrevocably foreclose the possibility of a compromise. In July 1775, the Congress formally endorsed the Olive Branch Petition, an instrument that essentially represented a final, desperate diplomatic overture to avert a complete severance of ties with the mother country. This petition articulated an enduring loyalty to King George III, while humbly imploring him to intercede with Parliament to redress the accumulating colonial grievances. Metaphorically, the Olive Branch Petition was the political equivalent of dispatching a hopeful message to a former romantic partner, inquiring about the feasibility of remaining friends. While technically conceivable, the desired outcome was highly improbable. King George III, however, refused even the courtesy of receiving the petition, and in August 1775, he dramatically issued a proclamation unequivocally declaring the American colonies to be in an official state of rebellion. This decisive act served as Britain's unambiguous rejoinder, effectively stating, "We are entirely uninterested in your overtures of friendship," thereby extinguishing any lingering, realistic prospects for reconciliation. The initial significant military engagement of the war, subsequent to the skirmishes at Lexington and Concord, was the Battle of Bunker Hill, a misnomer given that the primary fighting predominantly transpired on Breed's Hill. This nomenclature quirk seemingly underscored the inherent complexities embedded even in the naming conventions of Revolutionary War conflicts. The battle unfolded on June 17, 1775, when British forces initiated an attempt to breach the colonial siege of Boston by strategically securing the elevated terrain commanding views of the city. The American colonial forces, under the astute leadership of Colonel William Prescott, had diligently fortified Breed's Hill throughout the preceding night, meticulously constructing earthworks that compelled the British to launch an uphill assault against well-prepared and entrenched positions. The subsequent British offensive on Breed's Hill stands as a quintessential illustration of how not to execute military operations in the 18th century. General William Howe, who directed the ill-fated attack, opted for a direct frontal assault ascending the hill in broad daylight, evidently convinced that the colonial militia would precipitously flee at the mere sight of impeccably arrayed British regulars advancing in their customary formations. This particular strategy yielded results precisely as one might anticipate when assailing an uphill position against steadfast, entrenched defenders who had, for years, honed their marksmanship skills, perhaps even on British tax collectors. The steadfast colonial defenders, adhering strictly to the legendary directive to hold their fire until they could see the whites of their eyes, patiently withheld their volleys until the British forces were within dangerously close range before unleashing a devastating fusillade. The immediate consequence was catastrophic for the attackers. The initial British assault was repelled with a staggering toll of casualties, a fate that also befell their second determined push. The British ultimately achieved success on their third desperate attempt, but only after the colonial combatants had entirely exhausted their limited ammunition reserves and were consequently compelled to execute a tactical retreat. While the British could technically claim victory by seizing the contested hill, their triumph came at an exorbitant cost, suffering over 1,000 casualties compared to approximately 400 sustained by the colonists. This represented a type of victory so disproportionately costly that if replicated too frequently, it possessed the potential to financially cripple an entire empire. Beyond its immediate tactical ramifications, the Battle of Bunker Hill exerted several profound and far-reaching consequences. Crucially, it unequivocally demonstrated that colonial forces possessed the resolve and capability to confront and withstand British regulars in a direct, pitched battle. This realization delivered an immense surge to colonial morale, simultaneously inflicting a corresponding and significant blow to British confidence. Moreover, the engagement starkly revealed that the nascent war was destined to be considerably more expensive and arduous than anyone had initially envisioned. General Howe himself was reportedly heard to remark after the battle that he earnestly hoped he would never again witness such a victory, a sentiment that is, by any measure, profoundly unsettling when articulated by one's commanding general. The siege of Boston persisted throughout the harsh winter of 1775 to 1776, with both opposing forces contending with the formidable challenges inherent in sustaining military operations in the field during a severe New England winter. The British, ensconced within Boston, enjoyed a relative degree of comfort, but were, in essence, confined prisoners within the city, unable to venture beyond the protection of their fortifications without incurring the grave risk of attack. The Continental Army, conversely, endured far less comfortable circumstances, encamped in the rural environs surrounding Boston, with insufficient shelter, inadequate clothing, and dwindling supplies. Nevertheless, they maintained control over the encompassing territory and could rely upon the crucial support of the local populace. Washington's most formidable adversary during this protracted siege was not the British Army itself, but rather the internal struggles within his own forces. The Continental Army perpetually teetered on the brink of disintegration as enlistment terms expired, and soldiers, by agreement, returned to their homes. Washington consequently dedicated a substantial portion of his time to composing urgent dispatches to the Continental Congress, pleading for essential supplies, desperately needed funds, and the requisite authority to enforce military discipline. His correspondence from this period vividly portrays the exasperated complaints of a profoundly frustrated middle manager, striving to operate a business with a non-existent budget, an unreliable workforce, and a board of directors incapable of reaching consensus on fundamental organizational policies. The pivotal turning point in the protracted siege materialized in early 1776, marked by the extraordinary logistical feat accomplished by Henry Knox, a former Boston bookseller who had transitioned into an artillery officer. Knox executed one of the most remarkable logistical undertakings of the entire conflict. He had journeyed to Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York, a stronghold previously captured by Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold in May 1775, and subsequently orchestrated the transportation of 59 heavy cannons and mortars across more than 300 miles of unforgiving wilderness in the dead of winter. This monumental journey consumed 2 arduous months, involving the laborious hauling of massive artillery pieces across treacherous frozen rivers, through snow-blanketed forests, and over formidable mountain passes. It was, in essence, the 18th century equivalent of relocating a grand piano up a winding flight of stairs, albeit infinitely more arduous and compounded by the perilous necessity of evading British patrols. Knox's invaluable artillery train triumphantly arrived in Cambridge in January 1776, thereby furnishing Washington with the decisive firepower essential to render the British position in Boston strategically untenable. In March 1776, General Washington, demonstrating exceptional tactical acumen, oversaw the surreptitious placement of these formidable cannons on Dorchester Heights, an elevated position commanding a strategic overview of Boston Harbor. This monumental single-night operation caught the British forces entirely by surprise. The British garrison awoke to the startling reality of finding themselves directly under the muzzles of an artillery battery that had been conspicuously absent the preceding day, a truly inauspicious commencement to any morning. Confronted with the inescapable prospect of their ships and fortifications being subjected to an overwhelming bombardment by American artillery, the British command concluded that retaining control of Boston was no longer a viable or worthwhile objective. General Howe subsequently entered into an informal agreement with Washington. The British would evacuate Boston without causing any deliberate destruction, and in return, the Americans would permit their unmolested departure. Thus, on March 17, 1776, the British fleet gracefully sailed out of Boston Harbor, carrying with it approximately 1,000 Loyalist civilians who preferred the uncertainty of exile to a life under burgeoning American rule. With this departure, the siege of Boston formally concluded, and the Americans celebrated their inaugural major strategic victory of the war. The successful evacuation of Boston represented an immense propaganda triumph for the nascent American cause, unequivocally demonstrating that formidable British forces were indeed susceptible to defeat, and, crucially, that the burgeoning rebellion transcended the confines of a mere localized uprising in Massachusetts. This significant victory also served to firmly establish Washington's burgeoning reputation as a capable military commander, notwithstanding the fact that his achievement was primarily a testament to his unwavering patience and masterful logistical planning, rather than through the execution of brilliant battlefield tactics. Indeed, History frequently illustrates that the most profoundly impactful military victories are sometimes those that necessitate minimal actual combat. While the siege of Boston was drawing to its momentous conclusion, concurrent events transpiring elsewhere were inexorably propelling the American colonies toward an absolute and irrevocable separation from Great Britain. In January 1776, the influential writer Thomas Paine published his seminal pamphlet, Common Sense, a powerful treatise that eloquently advocated for American independence, articulated in language readily comprehensible to the ordinary colonist. Paine's writing style was characterized by its directness, fervent passion, and a complete absence of the diplomatic niceties that had largely defined most colonial protests up until that critical juncture. He unreservedly referred to King George III as the royal brute, and asserted with conviction that independence was not merely a possibility, but an inevitable destiny for America. A message that resonated deeply with many colonists who were, at last, prepared to embrace such a radical notion. Common Sense became an immediate and phenomenal bestseller, selling in excess of 100,000 copies within its initial 3 months of publication, and ultimately reaching virtually every literate household across the American colonies. Paine possessed an extraordinary talent for distilling complex political arguments and presenting them in a simple, yet profoundly powerful language that deeply resonated with the common populace. He cogently argued that America possessed both the natural resources and the demographic strength to sustain its independence, that any prospect of reconciliation with Great Britain was utterly futile, and that the attainment of independence was nothing less than America's manifest destiny. His persuasive rhetoric was akin to having an exceptionally compelling friend who finally convinces you to sever ties with a relationship you inherently knew was detrimental. Except in this grand historical drama, the someone was the formidable British Empire, and the ultimate breakup necessitated the deployment of cannons. The transformative impact of Common Sense simply cannot be overstated. It fundamentally reshaped the very parameters of the political discourse, shifting the core debate from reconciliation versus continued resistance to the stark choice between outright independence and perpetual subjugation. Prior to the widespread dissemination of Paine's pamphlet, the majority of colonists still perceived themselves as British subjects seeking a redress of their grievances. However, in the wake of reading Common Sense, a profound shift occurred, leading many to embrace a new identity as Americans striving for liberation from foreign tyranny. It remains one of those exceedingly rare instances when a solitary piece of written work genuinely altered the trajectory of history, undeniably proving that, at times, the pen truly is mightier than the sword. Though, it must be acknowledged, swords are often still required to lend weight to what the pen has so powerfully articulated. The Continental Congress, convening in Philadelphia during the spring of 1776, found itself under intense and escalating pressure to formally declare its independence. The prevailing military circumstances rendered any prospect of reconciliation increasingly improbable. Word arrived that formidable British forces were meticulously preparing a colossal invasion, while foreign mercenaries were actively being recruited and dispatched to combat the colonists. Moreover, the British monarch had unequivocally proclaimed the colonies to be in open rebellion. Beyond these immediate threats, the sheer practical demands of prosecuting a full-scale war necessitated that the colonies begin to conduct themselves as a truly sovereign nation. engaging in diplomatic negotiations with various foreign powers to secure vital aid and establishing robust, formal governmental structures to manage their affairs. The intricate journey toward declaring independence was far more complex than a mere proclamation that America had severed its ties with the British Empire. The esteemed Continental Congress was compelled to meticulously weigh the multifaceted legal, diplomatic, and military repercussions inherent in such a monumental and audacious decision. Embracing independence would instantly brand the colonists as traitors in the unforgiving gaze of British law, a capital offense punishable by death should their struggle for liberty ultimately fail. Furthermore, this bold step would mandate the creation of entirely new systems of governance and an arduous quest for international recognition and crucial support from other nations. It was akin to simultaneously resigning from one's employment, relocating to an unfamiliar metropolis, and embarking upon an entirely novel career path, all while facing the dire existential threat of execution if the ambitious endeavor did not succeed. The burgeoning movement advocating for independence gathered considerable momentum throughout the spring of 1776, as individual colonies began the pivotal process of formally instructing their respective delegates to endorse a declaration of independence. Virginia, a prominent Southern colony, decisively led this charge in May 1776, when its provincial convention issued explicit instructions to its representatives, urging them to propose independence to the Continental Congress. Consequently, on June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee, a distinguished delegate from Virginia, formally presented a resolution asserting that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. This pivotal resolution effectively served as a formal, legally worded proposition to dissolve the fraught relationship with Great Britain, encompassing all the necessary procedural gravity. While Lee's momentous resolution was undergoing rigorous debate, the Continental Congress judiciously appointed a select committee specifically tasked with drafting an official declaration of independence. This distinguished committee comprised an extraordinary collection of colonial luminaries: John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman, essentially a veritable dream team of intellectual and political titans from the colonies, though they likely did not perceive themselves in such grandiose terms at the time. Jefferson was ultimately chosen to compose the initial draft, a selection influenced partly by his recognized literary prowess, and partly because Adams and Franklin were already deeply engrossed in other pressing committee responsibilities. It is a curious historical footnote that sometimes the most profoundly impactful documents in history are penned by the individual who happens to possess the most available time. Jefferson's preliminary draft of the Declaration of Independence emerged as an unparalleled tour de force of political philosophy and strategic rhetoric. It masterfully interwoven profound Enlightenment concepts concerning natural rights with a comprehensive catalog of specific grievances directed squarely at British rule. Its immortal opening phrase is, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Articulated foundational principles that would profoundly inspire and shape democratic movements across the globe for centuries to come. This monumental undertaking was akin to articulating the fundamental creed for human freedom itself, an achievement of unparalleled significance by any measure. The declaration meticulously proceeded to enumerate 27 distinct and direct grievances against King George III, a comprehensive list spanning from the imposition of taxes on us without our consent to the severe act of cutting off our trade with all parts of the world. This extensive compilation read like an exhaustive inventory of every perceived affront and vexation the colonists attributed to British governance, encompassing both grave constitutional transgressions, such as denying trial by jury, and what might be considered more minor, though still irritating, provocations like sending swarms of officers to harass the people. In essence, Jefferson was crafting the most historically consequential breakup letter ever conceived, meticulously outlining in vivid detail why the existing relationship was irreconcilable and why the time had unequivocally arrived for a parting of ways. For several subsequent days, the Continental Congress engaged in intense deliberation and revision of Jefferson's original draft, implementing alterations that, while personally distressing to Jefferson, were likely deemed indispensable for pragmatic political considerations. The most pivotal excision was a substantial passage that vehemently condemned slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. This controversial section was removed strategically to prevent alienating the southern colonies, whose economies were deeply reliant on enslaved labor, and certain northern merchants who also reaped considerable profits from the slave trade. The profound irony inherent in proclaiming that all men are created equal, while simultaneously perpetuating the institution of slavery, was not lost on contemporary observers, and would indeed cast a long and troubling shadow over American politics for the entirety of the ensuing century. It serves as a stark reminder that even documents of revolutionary import sometimes necessitate uncomfortable compromises with the prevailing political realities. On July 2, 1776, the Continental Congress officially endorsed Lee's resolution advocating for independence. Subsequently, on July 4, 1776, they formally approved the definitive version of the Declaration of Independence. John Adams, a key figure, had initially presciently believed that July 2nd would become America's perpetually celebrated Independence Day. However, the course of history ultimately determined that July 4th would be the more enduringly memorable date, most likely because that was the precise moment when the delegates ratified the actual, tangible document, rather than merely the abstract concept of independence. The ceremonial signing of the Declaration was a moment imbued with profound drama, as each delegate quite literally risked their lives by affixing their signatures. As Benjamin Franklin famously, and perhaps grimly, remarked, "We must all hang together, or most assuredly, we shall all hang separately." The Declaration of Independence transcended its immediate function as a mere political instrument. It stood as a profound articulation of universal principles that would profoundly resonate with and inspire democratic movements across the globe. The groundbreaking assertion that legitimate governments derive their just powers solely from the consent of the governed, and that the populace inherently possesses the right to alter or even abolish governments that prove destructive of these fundamental ends, was nothing short of revolutionary in an era still largely dominated by absolute monarchies. It was akin to a bold pronouncement that the long-held dogma of the divine right of kings was, in actuality, nothing more than a remarkably persistent and widely accepted myth, an assertion that was naturally destined to engender considerable discomfort among the established powers. The immediate and transformative impact of the declaration was its pivotal role in converting what had been a localized colonial rebellion into a full-fledged war for independence. With all the far-reaching implications that this shift entailed, the colonists were no longer merely British subjects seeking a redress of grievances. They had unequivocally become Americans, actively fighting for their inherent freedom against a foreign power. This fundamental alteration in perspective proved absolutely crucial for sustaining morale throughout the arduous and challenging years that lay ahead, as it is inherently easier to endure immense hardship and sacrifice when one is fighting for the noble cause of national independence than when one is simply voicing complaints about taxation. Furthermore, the declaration carried significant diplomatic ramifications, as it effectively enabled foreign powers to lend their support to the American cause without technically being accused of interfering in Great Britain's internal affairs. France, in particular, which had harbored a long-standing desire to diminish British influence ever since its defeat in the 7 Years' War, expressed a keen and strategic interest in supporting American independence. The Declaration, in essence, erected a symbolic sign proclaiming "Help Wanted, Enemies of Britain," which was precisely the sort of shrewd international relations maneuver that the precarious situation imperatively demanded. Even as the Continental Congress was meticulously crafting and formally declaring independence in Philadelphia, the concurrent military situation on the ground was rapidly becoming exceedingly perilous. Although the British forces had previously evacuated Boston, they were now diligently preparing a colossal invasion armada, intent on decisively crushing the burgeoning rebellion once and for all. General Howe had strategically repositioned his substantial army to Halifax, Nova Scotia, where he was further augmented by significant reinforcements arriving directly from Britain and an imposing fleet of warships that would grant the British overwhelming naval superiority. The strategic British objective was to capture New York City, a move that would secure their control over the vital Hudson River and effectively sever New England from the remaining colonies. Washington, astutely recognizing that New York would inevitably be the next primary target, promptly relocated the Continental Army from Boston to New York in the spring of 1776. The formidable challenge of defending New York City was monumental. Its geographical layout, surrounded by water on multiple sides, rendered it exceptionally vulnerable to assaults from numerous directions by an adversary possessing superior naval capabilities. Washington's nascent army remained largely composed of short-term militia units, characterized by limited training and often inadequate equipment. In stark contrast, the British were deploying highly disciplined professional soldiers, well-trained German mercenaries known as Hessians, and commanding the most powerful and sophisticated navy in the entire world. The undertaking was akin to attempting to defend an intricately built sandcastle against the irresistible force of a towering tsunami, albeit one equipped with a considerably larger array of cannons. The colossal British invasion force that majestically sailed into New York Harbor during the summer of 1776 represented the largest military expedition Great Britain had ever dispatched overseas. General Howe personally commanded an estimated 32,000 seasoned troops, a formidable contingent that included approximately 8,000 Hessian mercenaries. This immense ground force was robustly supported by a massive fleet exceeding 400 ships, all under the direct command of his brother, Admiral Richard Howe. The sheer spectacle of this enormous armada, filling New York Harbor to its vast expanse, must have evoked feelings of both awe-inspiring power and profound terror among the American defenders, much like witnessing the ominous arrival of the Death Star into one's own solar system. Washington's Continental Army, conversely, nominally comprised about 19,000 men on paper. However, the actual number of effective, combat-ready troops was considerably smaller, a reduction attributable to widespread illness, frequent desertion, and the perennial logistical complexities inherent in 18th-century military operations. A significant portion of the American soldiers consisted of inexperienced militia members who had never before confronted professional troops in the brutal crucible of battle. Their equipment varied wildly in quality and availability, ranging from merely adequate to utterly non-existent. The glaring disparity in military might was so patently obvious that some American officers courageously suggested abandoning New York City without offering a fight. A recommendation that was likely sound military advice but proved politically untenable and impossible to implement. The Battle of Long Island, an engagement fought on August 27, 1776, represented the inaugural significant trial for George Washington in his capacity as a military commander, and it very nearly brought the nascent American Revolution to a premature conclusion before it had truly gathered momentum. General William Howe, leading the British forces, had conceived a strategic design to deploy his troops onto Long Island and then launch a multi-directional assault on the American positions. Utilizing his superior numerical strength and the disciplined professionalism of his soldiers to utterly crush Washington's army in a single, decisive confrontation. The strategic conception was undeniably sound, its execution competently managed, yet the ultimate outcome proved to be an unmitigated catastrophe for the American cause. General Washington had strategically positioned his forces upon the elevated terrain of Brooklyn Heights, from which they commanded a sweeping vista of New York Harbor. However, a critical oversight occurred when he failed to adequately secure the Jamaica Pass, an omission that afforded British forces a pivotal route to outflank the American defensive lines. The ensuing engagement rapidly devolved into a chaotic rout, with American troops scattering in widespread panic as the combined British and Hessian regiments pressed their advance from converging directions. The Continental Army suffered a grievous toll, sustaining approximately 1,400 casualties. A grim tally encompassing those killed, wounded, or captured, in stark contrast to the mere 400 losses incurred by the British. This profoundly lopsided defeat was precisely the kind of military disaster that typically quells rebellions, and it might well have extinguished this one, were it not for the extraordinary sequence of events that immediately unfolded. Washington found himself in a dire predicament, trapped on Brooklyn Heights with the depleted remnants of his army, facing the terrifying prospect of complete annihilation once the British completed their encirclement. The situation was so profoundly desperate that surrender appeared to be the sole rational course of action, and capitulation that would have irrevocably signaled the end of American independence, and, in all probability, led to the execution of the Continental Congress members as traitors. Instead, Washington made one of the most pivotal and courageous decisions of the entire war. He resolved to clandestinely evacuate his entire army across the East River to the relative safety of Manhattan, under the concealing blanket of darkness. The evacuation of Brooklyn stands as a testament to military audacity, an operation that defied seemingly impossible odds to achieve success. Washington faced the monumental logistical challenge of transporting approximately 9,000 men, along with their essential equipment and vital supplies, across a mile-wide stretch of water in a fleet of small boats, all while meticulously evading detection by the formidable British naval fleet. This precarious operation demanded nothing short of flawless timing, an environment of absolute silence, and a considerable measure of meteorological good fortune. Providentially for the embattled Americans, a dense, opportune fog descended just as the first glimmer of dawn began to break, effectively shrouding the final, critical stages of the evacuation from the vigilant gaze of British observers, who were undoubtedly left pondering the mysterious disappearance of their adversaries. While the successful evacuation from Brooklyn undeniably spared the Continental Army from utter destruction, it did not, however, resolve the myriad strategic predicaments confronting General Washington. The British forces maintained undisputed control over New York Harbor. They still possessed overwhelming military superiority, and Washington's army remained largely comprised of inexperienced troops who had just endured a demoralizing and comprehensive defeat in their inaugural significant engagement. In essence, this masterful withdrawal was akin to successfully extricating oneself from a blazing edifice. It was certainly preferable to the alternative, but one was nonetheless left without a secure sanctuary or a clear path forward. General Washington's arduous retreat from New York persisted throughout the autumn months of 1776, as relentless British forces pursued the Continental Army across the breadth of Manhattan, through the rugged terrain of the Bronx, and deep into the heart of New Jersey. The American military contingent found itself in a state of perpetual motion, engaging in sporadic, minor skirmishes to delay their adversaries, but deliberately eschewing any large-scale confrontations that could precipitate another devastating setback akin to the debacle at Long Island. This prolonged movement constituted a calculated strategic withdrawal, though for the exhausted and demoralized soldiers enduring the march, the experience likely bore a far greater resemblance to an ignominious flight. The protracted withdrawal through the challenging landscapes of New Jersey undeniably represented one of the nadirs of the entire American Revolution. During this bleak period, General Washington's army suffered a steady and alarming diminution in numbers, as soldiers increasingly chose to desert. Their terms of enlistment reached their conclusion without renewal, and entire operational units simply disintegrated under the immense pressure. By the arrival of December 1776, the beleaguered Continental Army had dwindled to a skeletal force of fewer than 3,000 combat-ready troops, and even these remaining individuals were woefully under-equipped, profoundly demoralized, and harbored a fervent desire to return to their homes. Concurrently, the British forces had settled into comfortable winter encampments across New Jersey, seemingly secure in their conviction that the American insurgency had been, to all practical intents and purposes, decisively quelled. The profound existential crisis gripping the nascent American cause in late 1776 spurred the influential pamphleteer Thomas Paine to compose his seminal work, The American Crisis. This powerful publication emerged as a vital instrument in bolstering and sustaining American morale during what was arguably the most desolate and perilous phase of the entire conflict. Paine's renowned opening declaration, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman, masterfully encapsulated the dire straits facing the revolutionaries, while simultaneously issuing a fervent clarion call for unwavering American perseverance. It functioned as an impassioned motivational address, a rousing pep talk disseminated to an entire struggling nation, arriving at precisely the critical juncture when such words were most desperately required. General Washington acutely perceived the imperative for a decisive military triumph, not merely to rejuvenate the shattered morale of his forces, but to forestall the utter and irreversible collapse of the American revolutionary endeavor. The formidable challenge lay in the fact that his severely depleted and weakened army was patently incapable of assaulting any significant British stronghold. Moreover, the sands of time were rapidly running out, as the enlistment periods for a substantial portion of his soldiers were slated to conclude by the end of December. Washington's audacious solution was to target a more modest, isolated garrison, one that might prove susceptible to a meticulously executed surprise attack. Specifically, the Hessian mercenary troops quartered in Trenton, New Jersey. The strategic blueprint to launch an offensive against Trenton was, by any reasonable assessment, audacious to the brink of outright recklessness. General Washington would be compelled to navigate the treacherous, ice-choked waters of the Delaware River in the dead of winter, subsequently led his troops on a grueling 9-mile march through the blinding intensity of a snowstorm, and then confront a well-entrenched, fortified position defended by highly trained professional soldiers. All of this was to be undertaken with an army teetering precariously on the precipice of complete disintegration. Such a complex operation inherently demanded flawless execution at every stage, a level of perfection that one would typically avoid wagering an entire revolution upon. Yet the exigencies of the moment dictated that desperate circumstances necessitate desperate remedies, and Washington's predicament was as profoundly desperate as any leader could possibly face. The legendary crossing of the Delaware River on the frigid Christmas night of 1776 has indelibly etched itself as one of the most celebrated episodes within the annals of American history, forever immortalized in Emanuel Leutze's iconic painting, which dramatically depicts General Washington standing heroically amidst a boat filled with resolute soldiers. The actual experience, however, was likely far less romanticized and considerably more arduous. Soldiers grappled with oars encrusted in ice. Horses struggled for purchase and slipped precariously on the frozen riverbanks, and a pervasive sense of doubt lingered among all present as they questioned the viability of this seemingly insane undertaking. The arduous crossing consumed significantly more time than anticipated, and by the moment Washington's determined force finally achieved the New Jersey shoreline, they found themselves several hours behind their meticulously planned schedule. Now confronted with the alarming prospect of launching their assault in the revealing glare of daylight rather than under the concealing cloak of pre-dawn darkness. The audacious assault on Trenton, executed on the morning of December 26, 1776, culminated in a resounding success that far surpassed even General Washington's most optimistic projections. The Hessian garrison, under the command of Colonel Johann Rall, was utterly blindsided by the American offensive. Having indulged in Christmas festivities the previous day, they evidently harbored no expectation that any adversary would be sufficiently audacious, or indeed crazy enough, to launch an attack amidst the fury of a raging snowstorm. The engagement itself was remarkably brief, lasting less than an hour, during which the American forces managed to secure nearly 1,000 prisoners while sustaining only a negligible number of casualties. This triumph was precisely the kind of profoundly dramatic and morale-boosting victory that the faltering American cause so desperately required. The triumphant outcome at Trenton resonated with consequences that extended far beyond its immediate tactical military implications. This pivotal victory conclusively demonstrated that the beleaguered Continental Army still possessed the capacity to engage in combat and emerge victorious, a revelation absolutely crucial for reinvigorating flagging morale and staunching the alarming tide of mass desertions. Furthermore, it powerfully underscored the fact that the formidable British forces and their Hessian allies were not, in fact, invincible, a realization that significantly emboldened and encouraged a greater number of Americans to commit themselves to the revolutionary cause. Most crucially, this success endowed General Washington with the indispensable credibility he required to persuade his weary and disheartened soldiers to prolong their terms of enlistment and steadfastly continue the fight. Indeed, this episode served as a powerful illustration that on occasion, a modest victory achieved at a precisely opportune moment can far outweigh the strategic value of a grander triumph occurring at an inopportune juncture. General Washington adeptly capitalized on the momentum generated by the Trenton victory, orchestrating yet another successful offensive against British forces at Princeton on January 3, 1777. This subsequent triumph provided an additional, significant surge to American morale and enabled the establishment of secure winter quarters in Morristown, New Jersey. The entire Princeton campaign served as compelling evidence that Washington had thoroughly assimilated the lessons from his earlier, painful defeats, evolving rapidly into a far more adept and effective military commander. He was clearly in the process of refining a sophisticated strategic doctrine centered on assiduously avoiding direct, large-scale confrontations with the superior British Army, while instead focusing on swift, decisive strikes against isolated and vulnerable enemy outposts. This shrewd approach skillfully leveraged the inherent strengths of his Continental Army while simultaneously mitigating its considerable weaknesses. The unforgiving winter months spanning 1776 into 1777 ultimately signified a profound turning point in the trajectory of the war. This shift occurred not because the military landscape had undergone a fundamental alteration in terms of power dynamics, but rather because both the British and American belligerents began to internalize the stark realization that this conflict would be a protracted, arduous struggle, rather than concluding in a swift resolution for either side. The British had undeniably showcased their formidable military supremacy on the battlefield, yet they had conspicuously failed to decisively extinguish the burgeoning rebellion. Conversely, the Americans had powerfully demonstrated their remarkable capacity to endure profound military setbacks and persist in the fight, though they remained confronted by colossal obstacles concerning the provision of adequate supplies, the necessity of rigorous troop training, and the urgent need for international diplomatic recognition. The overarching British strategic objective for the year 1777 was meticulously crafted to bring about a conclusive end to the war by effectively severing New England from the remaining American colonies. This intricate blueprint, masterminded by General John Burgoyne, envisioned a formidable three-pronged offensive designed to converge upon Albany, New York, thereby securing British dominion over the strategically vital Hudson River Valley. Burgoyne himself was slated to spearhead an advance southward from Canada with an estimated force of 8,000 troops, while General Howe was expected to simultaneously push northward from New York City. A smaller contingent, commanded by Colonel Barry St. Leger, would advance eastward from Lake Ontario to complete the encirclement. It was an undeniably ambitious scheme, one that appeared highly promising in theoretical design, but its successful execution hinged entirely upon the impeccably precise coordination of forces operating across hundreds of miles with the inherent limitations of 18th-century communication. The fundamental flaw embedded within General Burgoyne's otherwise elaborate strategy lay in its critical reliance on the presumptive cooperation of General Howe. However, Howe harbored distinctly divergent notions regarding the most efficacious path to achieving British victory. Rather than adhering to the coordinated plan and moving northward to provide essential support to Burgoyne's advance, Howe instead opted to launch an offensive against Philadelphia, evidently operating under the conviction that the capture of the American capital would conclusively extinguish the rebellion. This unilateral decision left Burgoyne to press forward into the challenging New York terrain, utterly devoid of the crucial reinforcements and concerted action he had been anticipating, a strategic blunder that might be likened to meticulously organizing a surprise celebration only to discover that half of the invited guests have independently chosen to attend an entirely different gathering. General Burgoyne's invasion initially showed considerable promise, with his forces successfully capturing Fort Ticonderoga in July 1777, a position long esteemed as a critical American stronghold. The swift loss of Ticonderoga, abandoned without a fight, provoked widespread panic across New England and ignited fervent criticism of the American commanders. Nevertheless, Burgoyne's campaign encountered immediate difficulties following this early success, as his army became profoundly mired in the arduous wilderness terrain situated between Lake Champlain and the Hudson River. The American strategy devised to confront Burgoyne's invasion was initially developed by General Philip Schuyler and subsequently executed by General Horatio Gates, who superseded Schuyler in command of the Northern Department. This tactical approach prioritized avoiding major pitched battles, instead focusing on relentlessly harassing Burgoyne's vulnerable supply lines and deliberately slowing his arduous advance through the dense wilderness. American forces systematically felled towering trees to obstruct vital roads, demolished bridges, and generally rendered Burgoyne's march as excruciatingly difficult as humanly possible. It was akin to the world's most elaborate practical joke, albeit one with exceptionally grave military consequences. Burgoyne's army, an unwieldy procession that included not only disciplined soldiers, but also hundreds of camp followers, numerous artillery pieces, and cumbersome baggage wagons, was inherently ill-suited for the demands of wilderness warfare. The entire force progressed at an agonizingly slow pace through the dense forests of upstate New York, at times averaging merely a mile per day. Compounding these logistical challenges, Burgoyne had also made the questionable decision to bring along a substantial amount of personal baggage, including fine wines and his mistress, which undoubtedly hampered the army's already compromised mobility. It was, quite literally, like attempting to relocate a small city through a forest, an endeavor precisely as impractical as it sounds. The first significant setback for Burgoyne manifested at the Battle of Bennington on August 16, 1777. Here, a detachment of his army, dispatched to seize American supplies, was instead decisively defeated by the New Hampshire militia under General John Stark. Stark famously rallied his men before the engagement with the stirring declaration, "We'll beat the enemy, or Molly Stark sleeps a widow tonight," a statement that could be interpreted as either profoundly confident or deeply fatalistic. The Americans not only vanquished the combined Hessian and British forces, but also captured much-needed provisions and equipment, while Burgoyne suffered an irreplaceable loss of approximately 900 men. Meanwhile, the western component of the British strategic design also encountered formidable impediments. Colonel St. Leger's advance from Lake Ontario was effectively halted at Fort Stanwix by resolute American forces commanded by Colonel Peter Gansevoort, who unequivocally demonstrated that not all American commanders were willing to abandon their posts at the first sign of trouble. The ensuing siege of Fort Stanwix evolved into an exceptionally complex affair, drawing in not only British regulars and American Continentals, but also fervent Loyalist militia and various Native American tribes, thereby transforming the Mohawk Valley into a convoluted tapestry of competing allegiances and military operations. The successful relief of Fort Stanwix was ingeniously accomplished by Benedict Arnold, who, at this point in the war, remained unequivocally one of America's most effective military commanders, having not yet contemplated treason as a viable career path. Arnold employed a clever combination of military pressure and psychological warfare to convince St. Leger to abandon the siege, notably by spreading rumors that a massive American army was rapidly approaching. St. Leger's subsequent retreat effectively eliminated the western prong of Burgoyne's strategy and liberated American forces to concentrate their efforts against the main British advance. By September 1777, General Burgoyne found himself in an increasingly desperate predicament. His army was critically low on essential supplies. His vital communication lines with Canada were under relentless assault, and American forces were steadily amassing in ever greater numbers to oppose his progression. Burgoyne had finally reached the Hudson River near Saratoga, but rather than the anticipated easy march to Albany, he confronted a formidable, well-entrenched American army under General Gates, a force that, remarkably, was numerically superior to his own. The pivotal battles of Saratoga, fiercely contested on September 19th and October 7th, 1777, are unequivocally recognized as the turning point of the American Revolution, although it is doubtful the fighting soldiers perceived them as such. The initial engagement, known as the Battle of Freeman's Farm, concluded in what was essentially a costly stalemate, with both sides enduring heavy casualties, yet neither securing a decisive advantage. This battle was particularly noteworthy for the devastating effectiveness of American riflemen against British officers and for the aggressive, almost ubiquitous tactics displayed by Benedict Arnold, who seemed to be everywhere at once during the combat. The second engagement, known as the Battle of Bemis Heights, resulted in a clear American victory that effectively sealed Burgoyne's fate. Arnold, controversially relieved of command by Gates following a dispute over tactics, participated in this crucial battle without official authorization and was wounded while audaciously leading a charge against British positions. Arnold's unauthorized heroics were characteristic of his military style, exceptionally effective but profoundly insubordinate, a duality that likely contributed to his later infamous decision to defect. Following his decisive defeat at Bemis Heights, Burgoyne found his beleaguered forces completely surrounded by American troops, with no realistic hope of relief or escape. His army was rapidly depleting its dwindling stores of food and ammunition. Desertion rates were alarmingly increasing, and American forces continued to grow stronger daily as fresh militia units converged from across New England. Consequently, on October 17, 1777, Burgoyne was compelled to surrender his entire army of nearly 6,000 men to General Gates in what became historically known as the Convention of Saratoga. The capitulation at Saratoga represented the most profoundly significant American triumph of the war up to that moment, eliminating an entire British army and unequivocally demonstrating that American forces could indeed defeat professional European troops in conventional warfare. This monumental victory exerted an immense psychological impact, dramatically boosting American morale, while simultaneously delivering a staggering shock to British public opinion. More critically, it convinced France that the Americans possessed a realistic prospect of securing their independence, thereby opening the door to the pivotal foreign alliance that would ultimately prove decisive. The momentous French decision to enter the war was predicated upon a sophisticated interplay of strategic calculation and a deeply ingrained historical animosity toward Great Britain. Ever since its ignominious defeat in the 7 Years' War, France had assiduously sought a propitious opportunity to diminish Britain's global power. American independence offered a compelling pathway to achieve this long-standing objective, concurrently unlocking promising new avenues for lucrative trade. The resounding victory at Saratoga furnished French officials with the incontrovertible evidence they required, affirming that supporting America constituted a judicious and worthwhile investment rather than a futile expenditure on a lost cause. The seminal Franco-American alliance, formally inked in February 1778, irrevocably transmuted the nature of the American Revolution, elevating it from a localized colonial insurgency into a sprawling, globalized conflict. France extended not only invaluable military and naval assistance, but also crucial diplomatic recognition, a powerful endorsement that emboldened other significant European powers to champion the American cause. Ultimately, both Spain and the Netherlands would join the hostilities against Great Britain, compelling the British Empire to disperse its formidable resources and vigorously defend its far-flung interests across the globe, rather than singularly focusing its entire military might on quelling the American rebellion. The formal entry of France into the escalating global conflict fundamentally reconfigured British strategic imperatives, compelling them to divert considerable attention and resources to safeguarding their vital interests in distant theaters such as the Caribbean, Gibraltar, and India, in addition to prosecuting the war in North America. Consequently, the British High Command was no longer able to singularly concentrate its comprehensive military endeavor upon the American colonies, a strategic dispersal that inadvertently afforded the American forces much-needed respite and the crucial opportunity to meticulously reconstitute their ranks and vigorously persist in their struggle for independence. Concurrently, as these profoundly momentous diplomatic transformations were unfolding on the international stage, General Washington and the beleaguered Continental Army were undergoing one of the most arduous and trying periods of the entire conflict at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, during the brutal winter months of 1777 to 1778. The Army had strategically retreated to Valley Forge, subsequent to their unsuccessful endeavors to thwart the British capture of Philadelphia. And these makeshift winter encampments swiftly became an enduring emblem of American tenacity and unwavering perseverance when confronted with seemingly insurmountable adversities. The prevailing conditions at Valley Forge were unequivocally appalling, even when judged against the notoriously harsh military standards of the 18th century. The soldiers suffered from a critical dearth of sufficient sustenance, proper attire, and adequate shelter, with numerous individuals forced to traverse the frozen ground barefoot in the snow, leaving indelible crimson trails as they stoically performed their duties. Rampant disease ravaged the encampment. Essential provisions were virtually non-existent, and the collective morale plummeted to its lowest ebb. General Washington, in a poignant and urgent communication to the Continental Congress, starkly warned that unless these dire circumstances were swiftly ameliorated, this army must inevitably be reduced to one or other of these three things: starve, dissolve, or disperse. The profound suffering endured at Valley Forge was rendered even more agonizing by the bitter awareness that ample food and vital supplies did, in fact, exist within the region, but were tragically failing to reach the embattled army. This critical logistical failure stemmed from systemic deficiencies within the Continental Congress's nascent financial framework and a widespread collapse of the established supply networks. Farmers, faced with economic uncertainty, frequently exhibited a marked reluctance to part with their valuable produce in exchange for continental currency, which was rapidly depreciating into near worthlessness. They pragmatically preferred to conduct commerce with the British forces, who proffered payment in the universally accepted and stable mediums of gold and silver. Thus, the Continental Army found itself in the cruel paradox of literally starving in the very midst of abundant plenty. Notwithstanding the horrific hardships and pervasive suffering, Valley Forge paradoxically evolved into an extraordinarily crucial period for the fundamental development of the Continental Army, forging it into a far more effective and cohesive fighting force. During this challenging encampment, the army was joined by Baron Friedrich von Steuben, an experienced Prussian officer who selflessly volunteered his expertise to rigorously train American troops in the sophisticated European military tactics and stringent discipline of the era. Steuben's comprehensive and demanding training regimen systematically transformed the Continental Army from a disparate aggregation of loosely organized militia units into something closely approximating a professional military establishment, imparting everything from the rudimentary principles of basic drill to intricate and advanced battlefield maneuvers. Baron von Steuben's innovative training methodologies were meticulously tailored to the distinct conditions and prevailing attitudes within the American military ranks. Recognizing the fundamental difference between the independent spirit of American citizen soldiers and the typical European conscripts, he deliberately shifted focus from rigid, ceremonial drills to practical, immediately applicable battlefield competencies. Rather than merely issuing commands, Steuben engaged his troops by articulating the underlying rationale behind each military procedure, fostering understanding and commitment instead of blind obedience. Furthermore, he extended a level of respect to the common soldier that was notably absent in many European armies of the era. A significant hurdle for Steuben was the formidable language barrier. Possessing only a rudimentary grasp of English, he relied heavily on dedicated interpreters to convey his intricate instructions and forge a cohesive fighting force. The arduous winter encampment at Valley Forge also served as a critical crucible, instigating profound transformations in the Continental Army's command structure and overall organization. General George Washington shrewdly utilized this period of relative inactivity to meticulously overhaul his leadership framework, strategically elevating highly effective and meritorious officers while systematically removing political appointees whose battlefield performance had demonstrably proven inadequate. The military contingent that eventually departed Valley Forge in the spring of 1778, though numerically diminished compared to its entry, had been refined into a vastly superior instrument of war. It was exceptionally better trained, more efficiently organized, and possessed a far greater degree of internal cohesion than any American fighting force previously assembled. The efficacy of this profound transformation within the Continental Army was almost immediately put to the ultimate test when British forces made the strategic decision to abandon Philadelphia and consolidate their strength in New York. This critical evacuation was primarily necessitated by the pivotal entry of France into the conflict, a development that rendered the British presence in Philadelphia precariously vulnerable to potential assaults by French naval power. The ensuing British withdrawal across New Jersey presented General Washington with a coveted opportunity to engage the marching column, an engagement that culminated in the significant Battle of Monmouth on June 28, 1778. The Battle of Monmouth is remembered for several remarkable circumstances, not least of which was the extraordinarily oppressive heat under which it was fought, leading to a grim tally of casualties from heat stroke that tragically surpassed those inflicted by direct enemy fire. The engagement also bore witness to one of the most intense and public confrontations among American high-ranking officers during the entire Revolutionary War, as General Washington vociferously reprimanded General Charles Lee for an unauthorized and ill-advised retreat. Washington's outburst of anger was reportedly so profound and uncharacteristic that eyewitnesses attested to never having heard such vehement language from him either before or after that singular event. The military outcome of the battle itself was, by most accounts, an effective stalemate. Both contending armies subsequently asserted victory, yet neither managed to secure a decisive, game-changing advantage. Nevertheless, the exemplary performance of the Continental Army at Monmouth unequivocally validated the rigorous training regimen implemented by Steuben. American troops demonstrated an impressive capacity to stand firm against seasoned British regulars in open-field combat, and executed intricate tactical maneuvers even under the intense pressure of enemy fire. Following the inconclusive engagement, the British forces proceeded with their planned withdrawal to New York, while Washington's army strategically positioned itself in the Hudson Highlands, thereby inaugurating a period of strategic impasse that would largely define the character of the war in the Northern Theater for several ensuing years. The consequential entry of France into the war also marked the inauguration of the first substantial French military deployment to North America. When Admiral d'Estaing's formidable fleet of warships materialized off the American coastline in July 1778, the sudden appearance of French naval power held the potent promise of challenging Britain's long-held maritime supremacy, a crucial advantage that had greatly benefited the British throughout the preceding stages of the conflict. However, the inaugural joint Franco-American military endeavor, an ambitious plan to capture the British garrison situated at Newport, Rhode Island, regrettably devolved into an utter failure. This unfortunate outcome was primarily attributable to glaring deficiencies in coordination between the Allied forces and Admiral d'Estaing's contentious decision to unilaterally abandon the operation upon the unexpected arrival of a British fleet. The disheartening failure at Newport underscored a fundamental and persistent challenge inherent in the burgeoning Franco-American alliance. The two allied nations harbored distinct strategic imperatives and possessed differing military traditions and operational philosophies, factors which frequently rendered effective cooperation a complex and arduous undertaking. The French government's primary motivations centered on debilitating Great Britain and safeguarding its own colonial possessions and burgeoning global influence, whereas the American objective remained singularly focused on achieving complete national independence. These divergent priorities, while generating considerable friction and occasional tensions throughout the alliance's duration, never escalated to a degree severe enough to irrevocably fracture the crucial partnership. Following the events of 1778, the conflict in the Northern Theater progressively settled into a predictable pattern of strategic stalemate, characterized by both adversaries entrenching themselves in robust defensive positions, yet neither possessing the capability to achieve a definitive, war-ending victory. The British maintained firm control over New York City and its vital harbor, providing them with an indispensable and secure operational base. Conversely, the Americans exerted dominion over the majority of the surrounding countryside, from which vantage point they could consistently harass and imperil British supply lines. General Washington's overarching strategic approach during this prolonged period was fundamentally rooted in a cautious avoidance of large-scale, decisive battles, prioritizing instead the preservation of the Continental Army as an enduring and credible threat to British operations. This circumspect strategy often proved frustrating to many officers and political figures who ardently advocated for more aggressive military actions. Nonetheless, it was arguably the only pragmatic course of action, given the discernible disparity in relative strengths between the opposing forces. Washington possessed an acute understanding that as long as the Continental Army remained a viable entity, the British could never credibly claim outright victory in the war, irrespective of their control over major urban centers or their successes in individual skirmishes. By 1778, the principal focus of the war began a discernible shift towards the southern colonies, driven by the British government's calculated assessment that the South offered a more promising theater for achieving ultimate victory than the stalemated North. This ambitious Southern strategy was predicated on several key assumptions. Primarily, the belief that the Southern states harbored a significantly larger Loyalist population eager to support British forces, and secondly, that the region's predominantly plantation-based economy would prove far more susceptible to disruption and collapse than the more diversified and resilient economy of the northern colonies. The British Southern Campaign commenced auspiciously with the capture of Savannah, Georgia, in December 1778, an objective achieved with remarkable ease by a relatively modest British contingent under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Campbell. This initial success at Savannah significantly bolstered the confidence of British officials, seemingly validating the sagacity of their Southern strategy. Consequently, they embarked on the planning of more ambitious and extensive operations, aiming to systematically dismantle and suppress American resistance throughout the entire southern region. The American response to this burgeoning British Southern offensive was unfortunately encumbered by a familiar litany of persistent challenges that had plagued the Continental Army throughout the war. Chronic shortages of vital supplies, inadequate troop training, and pervasive political interference that often undermined effective military operations. Moreover, the Southern theater presented its own unique set of formidable obstacles, including a geographically more dispersed population, notoriously difficult and often impassable terrain, and a complex, often unpredictable amalgamation of regular troops, local militia, and irregular partisan forces operating on both sides of the conflict. The protracted siege of Charleston, South Carolina, which commenced in March 1780, ultimately culminated in the most substantial British triumph of the entire war. In May 1780, General Benjamin Lincoln was compelled to surrender the city along with his entire command, an army numbering approximately 5,000 men, to the formidable General Henry Clinton. The catastrophic loss of Charleston dealt a devastating blow to the American cause in the South, effectively neutralizing the largest American army in the region and granting the British undisputed control over South Carolina's most economically and strategically vital port. The resounding British triumph at Charleston was swiftly succeeded by a string of additional victories, which appeared to conclusively affirm the strategic wisdom of their southern campaign. Lord Cornwallis, who assumed command of British forces in the South after Clinton's return to New York, inflicted another crushing defeat upon an American army at Camden, South Carolina, in August 1780, thereby virtually eradicating any semblance of organized American resistance within the state. The victory at Camden was particularly conspicuous for the lamentable performance of the American militia, who notoriously abandoned the battlefield almost immediately upon the commencement of hostilities, leaving the Continental regular troops to be mercilessly overwhelmed by the numerically and tactically superior British forces. However, the impressive succession of British victories in conventional pitched battles was gradually counterbalanced by the escalating emergence of a brutal and relentless guerrilla war, which rendered their purported control over the South tenuous at best. Charismatic partisan leaders such as Francis Marion, Thomas Sumter, and Andrew Pickens masterfully organized ad hoc irregular forces, launching daring and effective attacks against British supply convoys, isolated garrisons, and loyalist militia units. These elusive partisan bands proved exceptionally difficult to decisively defeat, primarily because of their innate ability to seamlessly melt back into the civilian populace and their intimate, unparalleled knowledge of the intricate local terrain. The guerrilla conflict that raged across the South was marked by an unprecedented level of savagery and brutality, far exceeding anything previously witnessed in the Northern theater. Both sides were implicated in committing egregious atrocities against prisoners of war and innocent civilians alike. The conflict progressively assumed the harrowing characteristics of a full-blown civil war, with neighbor pitted against neighbor, and families tragically fractured by deeply entrenched and often irreconcilable political loyalties. The decisive turning point in the Southern campaign arrived with the appointment and subsequent arrival of Nathaniel Greene as the new commander of American forces in the South in December 1780. Greene, a highly esteemed and profoundly trusted subordinate of General Washington, introduced a radically innovative strategic approach that ingeniously blended conventional military tactics with the effective principles of guerrilla warfare. Eschewing the previous futile attempts to confront and defeat the British in conventional pitched battles, Greene deliberately embraced a strategy characterized by calculated strategic retreats, expertly combined with relentless harassment and targeted attacks on vulnerable British supply lines and isolated outposts. Greene's ingenious and resilient strategy was famously encapsulated in his enduring declaration, "We fight, get beat, rise, and fight again." This persistent and attrition-based approach was meticulously conceived to systematically wear down the British forces through an unceasing campaign of harassment and minor engagements, while simultaneously assiduously avoiding the kind of catastrophic, decisive defeat that had previously decimated and eliminated successive American armies in the Southern theater. The remarkable effectiveness of Greene's unconventional strategy was resoundingly demonstrated at the Battle of Cowpens on January 17, 1781, where Brigadier General Daniel Morgan skillfully led a smaller American force to a brilliant tactical victory over Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton's formidable British Legion. Morgan's ingenious battle plan was predicated on cunningly exploiting the known tendency of militia units to retreat under pressure. By artfully integrating their feigned withdrawal into a sophisticated tactical maneuver that expertly lured the British into a meticulously prepared trap. The battle subsequently stood as a quintessential textbook example of how a numerically inferior force, through the application of superior tactics and exceptional leadership, could achieve a decisive triumph over a more powerful and ostensibly superior adversary. Following the pivotal triumph at Cowpens, a succession of arduous military encounters ensued, systematically eroding the formidable British presence in the Southern theater. General Nathaniel Greene, demonstrating astute strategic acumen, confronted Lord Cornwallis's forces at Guilford Courthouse in March 1781. Although the Americans sustained a tactical defeat on the battlefield, the ferocity of Greene's resistance inflicted such devastating and irreparable losses upon the British contingent that Cornwallis found himself compelled to relinquish his ambitious campaign across North Carolina. Indeed, the toll was so severe that Cornwallis was famously quoted remarking, with a stark realization of his army's precarious state, that another such victory would ruin the army, underscoring the debilitating cost of his nominal success. Lord Cornwallis's strategic determination to reposition his military forces into Virginia during the spring of 1781 stemmed from a profound conviction that the rebellious Southern colonies would remain insubordinate and intractable so long as Virginia persisted in furnishing vital manpower and essential provisions to the burgeoning American resistance. This significant northward shift also served as a palpable manifestation of Cornwallis's mounting vexation with the relentless and elusive nature of the irregular guerrilla warfare that characterized the Carolinas. In that unforgiving landscape, even hard-won British battlefield triumphs consistently failed to translate into substantive political dominion or effective administrative governance over the vast and often hostile rural territories. The ensuing Virginia campaign inevitably thrust Lord Cornwallis into a direct confrontation with the Marquis de Lafayette, an exceptionally gifted young French volunteer who had rapidly ascended to become one of General Washington's most reliably trusted and capable subordinates. Though barely having attained the legal age for suffrage, Lafayette had been dispatched to Virginia at the head of a comparatively modest contingent, tasked with impeding British incursions and predatory raids. He soon found himself embroiled in a precarious cat-and-mouse contest against Cornwallis's significantly more formidable army. Lafayette's judicious strategic approach involved assiduously sidestepping direct pitched battles while concurrently orchestrating persistent harassment of British movements and logistical endeavors, a tactical prudence undoubtedly dictated by his forces being outnumbered by a staggering ratio of approximately 3-1. Initially, Lord Cornwallis's military undertakings within Virginia met with considerable success, as British forces conducted extensive raiding expeditions across the entire state, ultimately compelling the beleaguered Virginia government to evacuate its capital, Richmond, and relocate to Charlottesville. These relentless British incursions severely disrupted crucial American supply arteries and starkly underscored the inherent fragility of Virginia's expansive plantation economy when confronted with sustained military aggression. Nevertheless, despite these early gains, Cornwallis soon discovered that asserting genuine territorial authority within Virginia proved every bit as challenging and elusive as it had been amidst the volatile terrain of the Carolinas. He could indeed secure victories in engagements and temporarily seize control of urban centers, but he remained utterly incapable of establishing any enduring political hegemony over a populace that remained resolutely antagonistic to British rule. The fateful strategic directive that would ultimately seal Lord Cornwallis's destiny arrived in the form of orders from General Clinton, instructing him to establish a robustly fortified military installation along the Virginia coastline, one capable of receiving consistent provisions and reinforcements via the formidable Royal Navy. In response, Cornwallis selected Yorktown, a modest yet strategically situated tobacco port nestled on the banks of the York River, to serve as his primary operational headquarters. At the time, this selection appeared entirely judicious and well-founded. Yorktown boasted an excellent natural harbor, possessed inherent defensive advantages, and promised to function as an ideal staging ground for prospective future military maneuvers. Regrettably for Cornwallis and the British cause, this seemingly sensible choice would tragically morph into an inescapable snare, a veritable trap from which any prospect of extrication would prove utterly futile. The serendipitous opportunity to ensnare Cornwallis at Yorktown emerged from an exceptionally infrequent confluence of flawless synchronization between the American and French military contingents. General Washington, who had been meticulously formulating plans for a decisive assault on New York City, received intelligence that a formidable French fleet, commanded by the esteemed Admiral de Grasse, was making its northward passage from the Caribbean. This naval armada possessed sufficient strength and firepower to directly contest and potentially dismantle British maritime dominance within the critical Chesapeake Bay. Should de Grasse successfully establish undisputed control over the vital waterways surrounding Yorktown, Cornwallis's entire force would be irrevocably severed from any possibility of either naval reinforcement or emergency seaborne evacuation, thereby rendering his army acutely susceptible to a protracted and devastating siege. General Washington's audacious and ultimately pivotal choice to pivot his forces southward towards Virginia, abandoning his long-cherished objective of assaulting New York City, stands as one of the preeminent strategic determinations of the entire Revolutionary War. This monumental southward expedition necessitated an immaculate confluence of timing and intricate coordination between American and French military units, which were operating across vast distances spanning hundreds of miles, often without the benefit of any truly dependable or rapid means of communication. It was a logistical gambit akin to meticulously orchestrating a grand surprise celebration, where a significant portion of the invitees were required to traverse an entire continent, arriving at the precise designated moment, with the critical distinction that the ramifications of any misstep or operational breakdown were immeasurably more dire and profound than merely a spoiled social gathering. The arduous and clandestine march to Yorktown itself constituted a veritable logistical tour de force, powerfully illustrating the remarkable degree of maturation and enhanced operational proficiency attained by the Continental Army since the nascent and often chaotic early phases of the conflict. General Washington, in close collaboration with his distinguished French counterpart, the Comte de Rochambeau, masterfully orchestrated the movement of their combined Allied armies over an astonishing distance, exceeding 400 miles in a span of less than a single month. Crucially, they meticulously preserved absolute secrecy regarding their ultimate objective until their forces had advanced sufficiently far south to effectively preclude any meaningful interception by British reconnaissance or military units. This monumental undertaking further demanded the skillful negotiation of numerous formidable river crossings and seamless coordination with the French naval contingent, all while simultaneously ensuring the continuous provision of vital supplies to the troops and diligently upholding troop morale amidst the arduous journey. The formal commencement of the siege of Yorktown transpired on September 28, 1781, as the formidable combined forces of the American and French armies, numbering approximately 17,000 resolute soldiers, meticulously encircled Lord Cornwallis's beleaguered contingent of roughly 8,000 British and German troops. This protracted military operation adhered faithfully to the established classical European methodology of siege warfare, characterized by the systematic, gradual advancement towards the adversary's defensive fortifications. This involved the painstaking excavation of successive parallel trenches, meticulously shielded by relentless artillery barrages that progressively rendered the existence of the besieged defenders increasingly arduous and desperate. It represented, in essence, an exceedingly deliberate and scrupulously methodical mode of combat, one that unequivocally prioritized the intricate disciplines of military engineering and strategic calculation above individual acts of audacious valor or conventional heroics. The paramount factor underpinning the eventual success of the siege lay squarely in Admiral de Grasse's absolute command of the vital Chesapeake Bay, a strategic dominance that effectively precluded the Royal Navy from either reinforcing or successfully extracting Cornwallis's entrapped army. The French fleet had decisively overcome a British naval contingent at the pivotal Battle of the Capes on September 5, 1781. This engagement, widely recognized as one of the most profoundly consequential naval confrontations in American history, was not, by conventional standards, particularly visually dramatic. It primarily involved extensive tactical maneuvering and comparatively limited direct combat. Nevertheless, its far-reaching consequences proved monumental, for it irrevocably sealed Lord Cornwallis's dire predicament and ultimate downfall at Yorktown. The intricate siege operations at Yorktown were meticulously executed in strict adherence to the formal, codified conventions of the 18th century warfare, wherein both opposing factions, even amidst their lethal endeavors, meticulously observed the customary courtesies and protocols of the era. The Allied forces systematically advanced their siege lines, painstakingly extending their network of trenches ever closer to the formidable British fortifications. These forward positions were ingeniously protected by robust fascines and gabions, cylindrical bundles of brushwood and wicker baskets filled with earth, which afforded crucial cover and protection from the incessant enemy fire. While the labor was undeniably perilous and physically taxing, it was simultaneously characterized by a rigorous methodicalness and predictable progression. The established tenets of siegecraft were universally understood, and this particular engagement unfolded precisely according to the textbook standard pattern. The decisive turning point in the protracted siege arrived when the Allied forces successfully stormed and seized two critical British redoubts small but formidable defensive outposts that crucially anchored the enemy's outer defensive perimeter. This strategic conquest enabled the Allies to reposition their heavy artillery sufficiently close to render the British garrison's position utterly indefensible and unsustainable. The daring and meticulously planned assault on these key redoubts was spearheaded by the dynamic duo of Alexander Hamilton and the Marquis de Lafayette, affording these two future American political adversaries a rare opportunity to share in the military laurels before their eventual, well-documented disagreements over national fiscal policy would emerge. The successful capture of these vital strongholds was achieved with remarkably light casualties on the Allied side, serving as a compelling testament to the superior planning and execution of the Franco-American siege operations. Lord Cornwallis's already precarious predicament inexorably descended into utter despair when a long-anticipated relief expedition, dispatched from New York, was catastrophically impeded by an unfortunate confluence of inclement weather conditions and woefully inadequate logistical coordination. General Clinton had, in fact, meticulously assembled a substantial fleet and an accompanying army specifically tasked with the urgent rescue of Cornwallis's beleaguered forces. However, this crucial expedition failed to set sail until October 19, 1781, an agonizing coincidence, as this was precisely the very day Cornwallis formally capitulated at Yorktown. The unfortunate timing was strikingly analogous to arriving at a momentous social gathering just as all the other guests were making their departure, with the profound distinction that this particular party represented a catastrophic military debacle, and its far-reaching consequences heralded nothing less than the eventual erosion of a global empire. The formal capitulation at Yorktown on October 19, 1781, was executed with every ounce of solemn pomp and elaborate ceremony demanded by the intricate military protocol of the 18th century. Lord Cornwallis, conspicuously absent and citing a convenient illness, dispatched his second-in-command to perform the symbolic act of surrendering his sword to General Washington. In a gesture imbued with both dignity and subtle command, Washington, in turn, instructed the British officer to present the sword to his own second-in-command, General Benjamin Lincoln. The British troops then commenced their march out of their formidable fortifications, their regimental colors reverently cased, and their accompanying bands poignantly performing the tune, "The World Turned Upside Down." This musical selection was either an extraordinarily apt and symbolic choice for the moment or, perhaps, a remarkable happenstance that has captivated and amused historians throughout the subsequent centuries. The complete capture of Lord Cornwallis's formidable army at Yorktown represented the long-anticipated and unequivocally decisive victory that the Americans had assiduously pursued throughout the arduous course of the war. The devastating loss of nearly 8,000 seasoned troops, coupled with the profound and debilitating psychological repercussions of such a comprehensive defeat, effectively extinguished any lingering British aspirations of securing a military triumph in the conflict. Moreover, this monumental victory served as an incontrovertible demonstration of the formidable efficacy of the Franco-American alliance, simultaneously proving that sophisticated European-style siege warfare could indeed be successfully executed on American soil, provided that the precise and requisite strategic conditions were meticulously cultivated and brought to bear. The momentous tidings of the Yorktown capitulation finally reached the distant shores of London in November 1781, reputedly eliciting from Prime Minister Lord North the now famous despairing exclamation, "Oh God, it is all over." Lord North's profound reaction was likely emblematic of the widespread shock and disillusionment permeating British official circles, many of whom had been confidently anticipating reports of Cornwallis's triumphant progress and consolidation of power in Virginia, rather than the grim reality of his utterly comprehensive defeat and the ignominious capture of his entire army. While the resounding victory at Yorktown did not instantaneously bring the protracted conflict to a formal conclusion, it unequivocally underscored to all parties embroiled in the war that the prevailing British military strategy had irrevocably failed, thus rendering some form of diplomatic negotiation and a subsequent peace settlement an unavoidable necessity. The interim period spanning from the decisive triumph at Yorktown to the official cessation of hostilities was principally defined by a perceptible and gradual deceleration of active military engagements, coinciding with the tentative commencement of earnest peace negotiations. Although the British forces still maintained control over strategically significant enclaves such as New York City, Charleston, and Savannah, they conspicuously refrained from undertaking any further substantial offensive operations. The Americans, for their part, were quite content to sustain their armies in a state of readiness within the field, while their diplomatic representatives diligently labored to meticulously define the intricate specifics of a comprehensive peace settlement. The prevailing atmosphere was strikingly analogous to the final moments of a grueling boxing match where, though both combatants remain upright, the undeniable victor has been unequivocally determined in the eyes of all observers. The subsequent peace negotiations, however, were rendered considerably intricate and fraught with complexities due to the fundamental reality that the conflict had metastasized into a truly global engagement encompassing numerous influential European powers, each harboring distinct and often conflicting geopolitical objectives. France, for instance, was primarily motivated by a desire to significantly diminish Britain's imperial might, but did not paradoxically wish for the newly emerging American Republic to acquire an overly formidable international stature. Spain, another key player, ardently sought the restitution of Gibraltar and aimed to impose restrictions on American territorial expansion towards the west. Meanwhile, Great Britain's overarching goal was to mitigate its considerable losses and, if feasible, strategically sow discord and division between America and its European allies. The intricate diplomatic maneuvering often created a precarious edge between America and its allies, a delicate balance that required astute statesmanship to preserve. The diplomatic discussions resembled an intensely strategic card game, a high-stakes poker match where each participant meticulously attempted to discern the hidden intentions and strengths of their counterparts. The American representatives for peace, specifically Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, demonstrated exceptional diplomatic prowess and acumen. Through their sophisticated negotiations, they successfully obtained treaty conditions that significantly surpassed the most optimistic expectations held by many at the commencement of the conflict. The Provisional Accord for Peace, formally concluded in November 1782, formally acknowledged the sovereignty of the American colonies, delineated the Mississippi River as the definitive western frontier of the newly formed United States, and bestowed upon American citizens the valuable privilege of fishing in the rich waters adjacent to Newfoundland's coast. This momentous achievement was akin to experiencing the exhilaration of a lottery victory. especially after having acquired a ticket whose very legitimacy was, at the time, uncertain and debated. The definitive Treaty of Paris, formally ratified on September 3, 1783, served as the official cessation of hostilities in the American Revolution, thereby solidifying the United States' status as a sovereign and autonomous nation. This comprehensive agreement meticulously reaffirmed the stipulations previously outlined in the preliminary accord and stipulated the complete withdrawal of all British military contingents from American soil. The formal signing of this pivotal treaty represented the ultimate fruition of 8 arduous years of armed conflict, a period that profoundly reshaped 13 British colonial entities into a unified and independent nation. Nevertheless, the subsequent monumental endeavor of constructing and consolidating this nascent nation would present challenges nearly as formidable as those encountered during the struggle for independence itself. The departure of British forces from New York City on November 25, 1783, signaled a profound symbolic conclusion to the American Revolution. General Washington, leading the formidable Continental Army, made his triumphant entry into the metropolis, at last realizing the strategic objective that had eluded his grasp since the calamitous military campaign of 1776. This significant evacuation proceeded without incident, as British military personnel embarked onto ships for their departure, concurrently as American soldiers assumed command and control of the urban center. The entire scenario bore a striking resemblance to the culmination of an exceedingly protracted and financially burdensome eviction procedure, with the singular, grim distinction that the departing occupants had actively endeavored to eliminate their landlords for a period spanning 8 years. General Washington's poignant farewell address to his assembled officers at Fraunces Tavern in New York on December 4th, 1783, represented a deeply emotional juncture, underscoring the profound personal connections and camaraderie that had been inextricably woven during the arduous and protracted struggle for national independence. Washington's deliberate choice to tender his resignation from military command and revert to the quietude of civilian existence was widely regarded as an extraordinary act by European commentators, who were historically accustomed to victorious military leaders leveraging their armed forces to usurp political authority. This voluntary and unprecedented relinquishment of ultimate power by Washington established a foundational precedent, one that would prove indispensable for the flourishing and sustained evolution of American democracy. The toll exacted by the American Revolution in terms of human lives was truly immense, even though precise casualty statistics remain challenging to ascertain due to the fragmented nature of historical records and the comprehensive inclusion of irregular militia units, non-combatant civilians, and allied military contingents. Expert historians conservatively estimate that approximately 25,000 Americans perished during the extensive conflict, encompassing both uniformed service members and the civilian populace, from a total national population then numbering approximately 2.5 million individuals. The British forces and their various allies endured comparable levels of attrition, while the financial burden imposed by the war proved to be utterly staggering for every participant. This entire protracted conflict resembled the most exorbitantly priced disagreement ever recorded in human annals, with the crucial distinction that this particular contention revolved around the foundational tenets of governmental structure and inviolable human rights. The profound social and economic repercussions stemming from the revolution proved to be every bit as consequential as its political ramifications. The widespread conflict systematically dismantled established social stratifications, concurrently forging novel pathways for upward social mobility and fundamentally questioning ingrained preconceptions regarding authority and societal distinctions. Furthermore, the eloquent discourse on universal equality and inherent natural rights, which had served as the moral bedrock justifying the revolution, simultaneously brought forth critical inquiries concerning the institution of slavery, the entitlements of women, and the equitable treatment of indigenous Native American populations. While the comprehensive resolution of these complex issues would unfortunately be deferred for numerous subsequent decades, the revolution itself functioned as a pivotal gateway, metaphorically opening a vast door to an array of unprecedented possibilities, even if the actual passage through that threshold proved to be a protracted historical journey. The far-reaching influence and reverberations of the American Revolution transcended the geographical confines of the nascent United States. This triumphant insurrection against the dominion of British rule ignited and galvanized numerous democratic movements across both the European continent and the vast expanse of Latin America, concurrently as the fundamental tenets eloquently expressed within the Declaration of Independence emerged as an exemplary blueprint for subsequent independent struggles globally. Moreover, the revolution unequivocally showcased the potent capability of subjugated colonial populations to effectively oppose and overcome entrenched European imperial powers, a revelation that would carry momentous and enduring consequences for the eventual trajectory of colonialism across the globe. The foundational establishment of the United States furthermore engendered substantial geopolitical ramifications, effectively inaugurating a formidable new power entity within North America, destined to ultimately contest and undermine European hegemony throughout the Western Hemisphere. Landmark events such as the Louisiana Purchase, the Mexican-American War, and the subsequent westward expansion culminating in access to the Pacific coast, all found their foundational impetus in the hard-won independence secured during the Revolutionary War. While the United States that emerged from the crucible of the Revolution was comparatively diminutive and militarily modest when measured against established European benchmarks, it nonetheless possessed an immense, latent capacity for future territorial growth and expansive development. The enduring legacy of the American Revolution perpetually shapes and informs American political thought and cultural identity, persisting with profound relevance more than 2 centuries following the decisive victory at Yorktown. The foundational tenets of constrained governmental authority, inalienable individual entitlements, and the ultimate sovereignty of the populace, all firmly established during the revolutionary period, continue to occupy a pivotal position within contemporary American political discourse, notwithstanding the ongoing evolution in their interpretation and practical implementation. Furthermore, the revolution meticulously crafted a compelling national mythology, one that prominently foregrounds narratives of liberty, egalitarianism, and unwavering opposition to despotic rule. While the empirical realities of American history have frequently diverged from these lofty ideals, the strategic and tactical military insights gleaned from the American Revolution were diligently scrutinized by military theoreticians and field practitioners for many generations, succeeding the conclusion of hostilities. The efficacious deployment of irregular guerrilla tactics, the indispensable significance of broad popular endorsement for military endeavors, and the inherent difficulties associated with prosecuting a protracted conflict within an adversarial geographical context, collectively emerged as focal points for rigorous military scholarly analysis. Additionally, the revolution conclusively underscored the critical value of cultivating robust international alliances and conspicuously illustrated the pivotal and often decisive influence that superior naval power could exert in shaping the ultimate results of terrestrial military campaigns. The American Revolution ultimately achieved its triumph through a strategic synthesis of armed resistance, sophisticated political structuring, astute international diplomatic engagement, and widespread popular backing, thereby rendering any prospect of a British victory untenable. Notwithstanding Great Britain's formidable and overwhelming superiority in both military and naval capabilities, the colonial forces adeptly managed to protract their resistance sufficiently, causing the war to become prohibitively costly and politically unpalatable for Britain to sustain, concurrently while securing crucial foreign aid that enabled a conclusive victory. This entire arduous process was akin to achieving success in a marathon not primarily by sheer speed, but rather through sheer endurance and outlasting one's adversaries, with the notable exception that this particular marathon spanned 8 years and featured the thunderous deployment of artillery. The profound metamorphosis of the American colonies from subservient British subjects into autonomous citizens constituted not merely a political alteration, but an equally significant psychological evolution that engendered a nascent and distinct sense of national identity. The collective ordeal of the Revolution, characterized by its severe hardships, profound sacrifices, and eventual glorious triumph, played an instrumental role in forging a unified American identity that successfully transcended pre-existing regional distinctions and diverse cultural backgrounds. Ultimately, the Revolution brought forth into existence not solely a novel geopolitical entity, but an entirely new populace, one that perceived themselves fundamentally as Americans, rather than as mere transplanted Europeans. The economic ramifications stemming from the Revolution presented a complex tapestry of outcomes, with the attainment of independence simultaneously ushering in both novel opportunities and formidable challenges. The newly formed nation acquired the liberty to engage in commerce with any global entity, thereby shedding the restrictive mercantile constraints of the British Empire. However, it concurrently forfeited the substantial safeguarding benefits afforded by British commercial and naval might. Furthermore, the protracted conflict had amassed colossal national debts that were destined to encumber American public finances for many ensuing decades. While the fundamental disruption of established trade networks inevitably spawned considerable economic instability, the advent of independence bore a striking metaphorical resemblance to dissolving a marital union with an affluent yet domineering partner. A severance that was undeniably liberating but inherently fraught with considerable financial intricacies. The Revolution additionally precipitated profound and often detrimental consequences for the various Native American peoples, who subsequently discovered themselves confronting a nascent nation exhibiting an even more pronounced and relentless drive towards westward territorial expansion than the preceding British administration. A significant number of Native American tribes had strategically aligned themselves with Great Britain during the hostilities, harboring the expectation that a British triumph would effectively curtail American encroachments into their ancestral domains. The eventual American victory, however, signified that these indigenous tribes now contended with an inimical government, displaying scant inclination to uphold prior accords or to genuinely respect established Native American land tenure rights. The contentious issue of slavery, which had been conspicuously circumvented for the most part throughout the Revolutionary period, despite its inherent contradiction with the fundamental tenets enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, burgeoned into an increasingly vexing problem during the subsequent post-war era. Certain segments of the American populace, especially those residing in the northern states, perceived the Revolution as an auspicious moment to eradicate the institution of slavery, whereas others, predominantly in the southern regions, viewed its potential abolition as an existential menace to their entrenched economic and social order. The Revolution had unequivocally declared that all individuals possessed inherent equality, yet it would ultimately necessitate a subsequent, even more devastating conflict to definitively ascertain whether that foundational principle truly extended its application to every single American citizen. The American Revolution painstakingly established seminal precedents for democratic governance, principles that were destined to profoundly shape political evolution across the globe. Concurrently, however, it also spawned a complex array of challenges that the nascent nation would grapple with for an extended period. The inherent friction between centralized federal power and the autonomy of individual states, the nascent emergence and function of political parties, the safeguarding of minority rights, and the definitional boundaries of democratic rule were all intricate issues that undeniably arose from the Revolution's crucible, but remained fundamentally unresolved by its conclusion. In essence, the Revolution served as the foundational act of authoring the initial chapter of what would become an extraordinarily lengthy and intricate historical narrative concerning the ideals and practicalities of democracy and self-governance. Securing global acknowledgement of American independence represented a monumental diplomatic achievement, effectively cementing the nascent United States' standing as a rightful participant within the global community. However, this hard-won legitimacy simultaneously ushered in a fresh array of weighty obligations and formidable obstacles for the fledgling republic. The newly formed nation was compelled to forge its own distinctive foreign policy, cultivate robust diplomatic relations with various sovereign states, and vigorously safeguard its burgeoning interests without the protective umbrella of the formidable British Empire. Attaining independence signified America's unencumbered freedom to chart its own course and render its own determinations. Yet it irrevocably bound the young country to confront and manage the full repercussions stemming from those pivotal choices. Ultimately, the profound essence of the American Revolution transcended mere liberation from British dominion. Its core purpose was the establishment of an entirely novel governmental paradigm, fundamentally rooted in the explicit consent of the governed populace and dedicated to the steadfast protection of individual, inalienable rights. The triumphant outcome of this audacious experiment in self-governance promised to exert far-reaching and transformative implications, not solely for the citizens of America, but also for oppressed peoples globally who grappled against the oppressive forces of tyranny and subjugation. The Revolution unequivocally demonstrated that ordinary individuals possessed the capacity to govern themselves, a truly revolutionary concept in an era dominated by absolute monarchical rule and entrenched aristocratic privilege. The compelling narrative of the American Revolution is, at its heart, a testament to the extraordinary power of transformative ideas to reshape the world. The colonists initially embarked on their journey by voicing their dissent against specific British legislative enactments and fiscal policies. but their courageous endeavors culminated in the birth of a new sovereign entity, meticulously constructed upon the foundational tenets of liberty, equality, and self-determination. Principles that would subsequently ignite and sustain democratic movements across continents for innumerable centuries to follow. From the initial fervent protests against what was perceived as unjust British taxation to the ultimate definitive establishment of American independence, the American Revolution unfolded as a protracted, intricate, and frequently brutal conflict. This momentous struggle irrevocably transformed 13 disparate British colonies into the unified United States of America, thereby giving rise to both a groundbreaking nation and an innovative form of governance destined to profoundly influence the trajectory of global history. The Revolution provided irrefutable proof that common individuals could successfully mount resistance against the most formidable empire on earth when they were fiercely committed to principles in which they deeply believed, a timeless lesson that retains its profound relevance in contemporary times. It appears that the original text intended for paraphrasing was not provided. To effectively transform and enrich a given passage, maintaining its core essence while diversifying its linguistic presentation, a source document is indispensable. Without the foundational content, the specific task of rephrasing, expanding upon ideas, and adhering to stipulated structural and tonal requirements cannot be commenced. Once the complete text is presented, the process of crafting a comprehensive and engaging reinterpretation, in strict accordance with the guidelines regarding length, stylistic consistency, and factual accuracy, can be readily undertaken.